Chapter 16-17. Time slowly passed. 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, a ray of spiritual light tore through the sky from the distance. Under this ray of spiritual light, it was as if time and space did not exist at all. It was instantly torn apart and distorted in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, this ray of spiritual light had already broken through layers of barriers and arrived before the hall that Luo Fan was in at this moment. It crashed into the hall. Kacha, as a result, the entire world trembled. At this moment, a gray and hazy existence began to spread out from the hall, turning everything around it into a gray and hazy appearance. At this moment, 2 rays of spiritual light spread out from the hall. The 2 rays of spiritual light instantly suppressed the gray and hazy restriction that was constantly spreading and destroying all of the surrounding spacetime. As a result, the gray and hazy state could not be suppressed and continued to spread. However, it only turned the spacetime within a few kilometers of the hall into a gray and hazy state. And within a few kilometers of Luo Fan's hall, there were no living beings. In fact, some of the other buildings didn't even exist at all. Fortunately, this was the case, so no one was injured during this process. It had to be known that this gray and hazy state could completely destroy spacetime and even everything else. If there was a living being within this range, as long as it was not at Luo Fan's level of strength, it would not be able to escape. With such a powerful method, what awaited him would definitely be death and his soul would dissipate. In the blink of an eye, he was completely assimilated by the gray and hazy existence and turned into nothingness. At this moment, the ray of spiritual light that tore through the sky had already surpassed the 2 rays of spiritual light. At this moment, it had already distorted and was no longer just a ray of spiritual light. Instead, it had turned into a figure that looked like a peerlessly beautiful woman. This figure itself was constructed from spiritual light, but it was not like what Luo Fan had always done. It was just the kind of spiritual light clone that condensed spiritual light into a human form. Instead, it was a more subtle and exquisite transformation. The spiritual light. It was as if she had divided it into countless special characteristics. Then, through these characteristics, she continued to combine and change. In the end, it formed the body of such a beautiful woman. This was a clone, there was no mistake about it. But compared to ordinary clones, it was more detailed, and the strength that it could display would definitely be more powerful. Of course, this kind of power was only for herself. If she were to use a spiritual light clone like Luo Fan's, it would be more powerful. However, this didn't mean that the power it could display was stronger than Luo Fan's spirit light clone. "Who are you?" Luo Fan's voice came from the 2 lights. At this moment, the palace had already disappeared. Although his 2 divine lights were still clashing with each other, they were still in conflict. The constant fighting had completely erased everything in the surroundings, but it had vaguely formed an invisible silhouette. It formed a huge invisible palace, trying its best to suppress the gray and chaotic scene, preventing the chaotic scene from spreading and posing a threat to this civilized country. This was also due to the fact that he had been able to integrate these 2 beams of spiritual light for the past 10,000 years. Otherwise, if he had encountered such a situation in the past, he would have died. Not to mention the fact that he wouldn't be able to limit the destructive range of these 2 beams of spiritual light, perhaps even he himself would be instantly destroyed by them. He would have completely turned into nothingness when his words came out. A spiritual light clone emerged from the spiritual light. This spiritual light clone was very different from Luo Fan's original spiritual light clone. The original spiritual light clone was purely formed from the spiritual light comprehended from the origin of the realm. But now, this spiritual light clone had 2 kinds of spiritual light. One of them was the spiritual light doppelganger he had formed in the past. It was the spiritual light he had comprehended and condensed from the realm essence. The other kind was the spirit light that was condensed from the origin of the world, in other words, from that indescribable place. At this moment, these two types of spirit lights existed in an extremely strange manner within the spirit light clone. They restrained and reinforced each other, but on the whole, they were constantly clashing and producing powerful destructive power that was constantly wreaking havoc in the body. However, in another direction they were switching with each other. During this switching, the spiritual light clone constantly replenished the losses between the two, so that the overall spiritual light clone remained the same and did not decrease because of this constant restraint. "You can call me the Divine Emperor," the woman said faintly. "So it's the Divine Emperor. Do I have any enmity with you?" Luo Fan asked with a frown. He had never heard of the Divine Emperor before. However, to be called an emperor, it was clearly an existence on the level of the Sand Emperor and the Realm Emperor. In other words, it was an existence that controlled a large area that spanned billions of light years. For the current Luo Fan, any one of these existences was not a small problem. Thus, he had no choice but to be wary of them. "You and I have no enmity, but the same cannot be said for your subordinates," the woman, who was also the Divine Emperor, said. "My subordinates? Could it be that Gui Shou has offended you in some way?" Luo Fan asked with a frown. In the past 10,000 years, he had been wholeheartedly integrating the two spiritual lights into his worldview of laws and did not care much about anything else in the outside world. As for what exactly happened to Gui Shou, who was under another Divine Emperor, in the other area, he did not care at all. Therefore, at this moment, he had no idea what Gui Shou had done to affect the Divine Emperor. Of course, if he had the intention to divine it, he would have known. However, he was not in the mood to divine it at this moment. Compared to Gui Shou's matter, he was more concerned about the many troubles he had now and how to integrate the two spiritual lights into his worldview of laws. Compared to this, everything else was secondary. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the Divine Emperor's face showed anger. The Celestial Emperor was enraged. Your good subordinates have already made a mess of my territory, causing it to fall into chaos." Luo Fan shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, please speak frankly. I am in quite a bit of trouble now, so I don't have the energy to make random deductions." Luo Fan shook his head and said. Hearing this, the Divine Emperor's expression became angry. She thought that Luo Fan was looking down on her. She sneered. "Then I will give you a chance to divine it properly." Saying that, she suddenly made a move. The countless spiritual lights on her body that had been divided into countless details instantly began to carry out a very surprising transmission. Countless spiritual lights formed an extremely complicated system. The power of the spiritual lights kept transmitting and changing, finally producing a kind of earth-shattering power. It instantly emerged from her hand. This kind of earth-shattering power had the characteristics of spiritual lights and the power of spiritual lights, but it did not have the appearance of spiritual light. It felt like the terrifying destruction caused by the spiritual light's destruction. After this force appeared, it suddenly gushed towards the spiritual light that was in conflict where Luo Fan's body was. That powerful force directly caused the surrounding space-time to crack. Countless grayish traces appeared from the cracks. It was clear that this power had destroyed everything in the surroundings the moment it appeared, causing the surrounding space to disappear and reveal the state of chaos. It looked as if the two spiritual lights below were clashing, and the impact had instantly spread to this area. It began to absorb the area within the range of that power. Facing this scene, Luo Fan's main body didn't move at all, but his spirit light avatar instantly moved. They saw. In an instant, the spiritual light doppelganger raised its hand and grabbed at the void. In an instant, strands of spiritual light appeared before that power. These wisps of spiritual light were not a single type of spiritual light, but a mixture of two types of spiritual light of completely opposite natures. The way these two spiritual lights mixed was extremely mysterious and complicated. Every single wisp of spiritual light seemed to be a part of an extremely intricate system, and when combined, the two types of spiritual light were able to reinforce and restrain each other to the extreme, thereby creating an unimaginable power. It created a defensive layer that would make even those in despair feel like they were looking up at a tall mountain. In an instant, it blocked that power. The moment the power and the defensive layer came into contact, the sound produced was unimaginably weak. Not to mention the world that could erupt with countless fluctuations like normal, even the sound of ordinary firecrackers exploding was much louder than this. It was as if all the sound produced by the impact had been completely suppressed and absorbed by one of the two sides. Facing this change, the Divine Emperor sneered. "You actually dare to be distracted and absorb the aftermath?" As she spoke, she raised her hand again. In an instant, power surged out, and an even more powerful and terrifying power gushed out. This time, this power was no longer just a form of power. Instead, it directly transformed into a magic treasure that looked like a round hammer. As soon as the magic treasure that looked like a round hammer appeared, the entire world began to tremble slightly. Tribulation clouds vaguely formed in the sky above. These tribulation clouds were extremely thin at first, but as time passed, they became denser and denser. Within the tribulation clouds, there was a faint flash of lightning. This lightning was bright and dazzling, and it had a powerful deterrent force. Along with the emergence of lightning, a series of dull rumbling sounds constantly came from within. Vaguely, there was a wave of anger descending from the void. Although it caused such a huge commotion, the round hammer itself looked so ordinary and normal. It looked like it was cast from ordinary steel. After it appeared, it directly smashed down on the defense created by Luo Fan's clone. The defensive layer created by the clone was extremely powerful, but at this moment, facing this round hammer, it suddenly seemed as weak as a piece of paper. Although this round hammer did not stir up any strong wind or any other special fluctuations, but just the momentum of it smashing down on the defensive layer already caused the defensive layer to suffer incredible pressure, and it was already faintly sinking in. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a kind of enlightenment in his heart. This was a magic treasure that was specially used to destroy. A single-use, pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. If he didn't have any other means, then this round hammer would inevitably smash his defensive layer. It might even directly pass through the defensive layer and bombard the two clashing spiritual lights, directly smashing apart the spiritual lights that were originally struggling to unite. At that time, what awaited him would be the result of his entire body being crushed by the power of the spiritual lights. What a powerful method! It's more than 100 times stronger than the Tsar's attack. Luo Fan instantly exclaimed in admiration. Back then, the Tsar had used his own means to condense a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that was countless times stronger than ordinary pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. But that kind of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure couldn't even condense spiritual light, and the powerful attack it erupted was not even comparable to the spiritual light attack he condensed. But the Divine Emperor in front of him was different. The pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure she condensed was indeed not as powerful as the mirror condensed by the Tsar. But because it was a single-use item, it was specially used to destroy. Therefore, not only could it erupt with an attack that was thousands of times stronger than that of the mirror. Moreover, after it was finally destroyed, the damage it would cause to this world would be countless times greater than that of the mirror. Moreover, after it was finally destroyed, the damage it would cause to this world would definitely be tens of thousands of times greater than that of the mirror. Perhaps it was also because of this that the tribulation clouds had appeared in the sky at this moment because of the appearance of the round hammer. After all, the appearance of the round hammer had caused the tribulation clouds to appear. After all, as soon as this round hammer appeared, It was almost destined to cause irreparable destruction to this world. Thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Almost in the blink of an eye, he had already figured it all out. It could be said that, at this moment, his situation had already worsened to the point where it was almost irreparable. However, even under such circumstances, Luo Fan's expression remained unchanged. His body was still within the spirit light, quietly sitting cross-legged within the gray haze. There was no movement at all. As for his spiritual light clone, in a flash, it directly appeared in front of the round hammer. Directly. It blocked the two colliding spiritual lights below, and the defensive layer condensed by the spiritual light clone. It was at this moment that the round hammer smashed into the defensive layer. In an instant, just as Luo Fan expected, the defensive layer instantly collapsed. An incomparably powerful impact spread out in an instant. This impact was no longer concealed at this moment, and there was no restriction at all. It directly submerged the entire mountain. The endless impact and shock waves instantly evolved into countless trillions of worlds. They densely piled up on the mountain, and in an instant, the entire mountain was completely engulfed. In other words, in an instant, the mountain had completely disappeared. What remained were the 30 million worlds that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had created on the mountain peak. They were still floating among the countless impact worlds and shaking worlds. Fortunately, these worlds had already been strengthened by Qing Yi and Yu Ji, so they could defend against the terrifying impact that was countless times stronger than ordinary worlds. Otherwise, under the impact of the impact and shaking worlds, these worlds would definitely collapse and be completely destroyed. In the end, all the living beings within them would disappear. The commotion immediately attracted the attention of Qing Yi and Yu Ji, who were in that world. In an instant, all kinds of indescribable fear appeared in their hearts. It must be known that right now, the 30 million worlds that they had created had practically become pieces of fallen leaves on the stormy sea. As the storm blew, they constantly wandered between the sea and the seabed. It felt as if each world would be completely crushed and destroyed in the next instant. Under such circumstances, how could they not understand that there was a power outside that they couldn't resist? How could they not be afraid? What's going on outside? At this time, Yu Ji said. Fortunately, the other living beings that had been enlightened by Luo Fan on this mountain had been taken away by Gui Shou a long time ago. Now, only Luo Fan, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji were on the entire mountain. Otherwise, the impact would have completely crushed and destroyed the mountain, and the result would have been countless times more tragic than it was now. We can't sense it at all, Qing Yi said with a solemn expression. So, I guess, Master must have encountered an enemy. Encountered an enemy? What should we do? How can we help Master? Yu Ji exclaimed at this time. Although Qing Yi said that he was only guessing, but Yu Ji felt that it was most likely the case. His master, Luo Fan, had really encountered an enemy. Otherwise, this matter couldn't be explained at all. We can't help Master at all, Qing Yi said with extreme humiliation and unwillingness. We are still too weak. Yu Ji was also rarely serious. In an instant, the two of them once again set their fighting spirit to cultivate. Luo Fan and the Divine Emperor naturally wouldn't pay attention to Qing Yi and Yu Ji. At this moment, they were paying attention to each other. Facing the round hammer that was constantly approaching him, Luo Fan's spiritual light doppelganger shouted at this moment. Then, boundless spiritual light surged out from his body. These spiritual lights directly condensed into two long rivers in the void. One of them had an endless sense of existence. Anyone who saw it would forever remember it. The other was a long river that had an infinitely close to zero sense of existence. This long river, no matter how long any living being looked at it, no matter how deeply they remembered it, as long as they turned their eyes away, they would naturally completely forget it. After these two long rivers appeared, They directly entwined in the shape of a double helix and directly rushed towards the falling round hammer. Chi chi chi, the two long rivers that formed the double helix instantly collided with the round hammer. Between the two sides, an unimaginable conflict erupted. The double helix long rivers continuously collapsed under the impact of the round hammer, but the round hammer, because of this, it constantly revealed its aura. For ordinary objects, revealing its aura naturally meant that they were becoming more and more powerful. But for a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure like this round hammer that originally had its aura restrained and didn't show any signs of abnormality, revealing its aura actually meant that its restraining effect on one's strength was becoming increasingly weak. This also meant that its might was constantly weakening. As this aura emerged, countless aura worlds naturally condensed, directly crushing the impact worlds and shaking world. In the blink of an eye, those worlds were completely replaced by this aura world. Similarly, the worlds that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had opened up were still perfectly preserved in this aura world, but at the same time, Qing Yi and Yu Ji, who were inside, felt even more intensely the terrifying degree of the battle that was currently taking place in this world. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the void finally reacted. Endless lightning bolts descended from the sky and directly struck the round hammer. These lightning bolts were completely different from ordinary lightning bolt. This huge difference did not lie in the strength of the lightning bolts, nor did it lie in the speed of the lightning bolt. Although these lightning bolts were indeed fast enough, even exceeding the speed of time, they had already reached their target as soon as they appeared. The real difference between this lightning and ordinary lightning was its creation. It was an unimaginable creation characteristic. The moment the lightning bolts struck the round hammer, a world of lightning was instantly created with the point of impact as the center. The entire world of lightning directly enveloped both sides, the round hammer, and the spiraling spirit light rivers. In other words, in the entire world of lightning, there were only Luo Fan's spirit light doppelganger, the Divine Emperor's spirit light doppelganger, the round hammer, and the spiraling river. Apart from that, everything else, whether it was the aura world, the world of Qing Yi and Yu Ji, or the two spirit lights below, was not within this scope. There's actually such a change? Luo Fan was shocked at this moment. Chapter 1618. In this world of lightning, everything that should exist in a normal world existed. Time, space, matter, energy, rules and laws, the great Tao, and so on. Anything that could be found in normal space-time could be found in this world of lightning. It could be said that the entire lightning world was no different from an ordinary world other than the fact that it was made of lightning. On the other hand, the stability of time and space in this world of lightning had reached an unimaginable level. Even the space-time in the outside world, which could easily recover from a battle between powerhouses like Luo Fan, was inferior to this world of lightning. At the very least, at this moment, the collision between Luo Fan's two spiraling rivers of spiritual light and the round hammer was enough to shatter the space-time of the outside world, revealing the primal chaos hidden below. However, in this world of lightning, the collision merely caused ripples to appear in the space-time. The space-time itself didn't even shatter because of this, let alone shattering it completely to the point of revealing a state of chaos. The toughness of this space-time had clearly reached a level that shocked even Luo Fan. Under such a degree of toughness of space and time, Luo Fan even felt that his divine abilities were inexplicably restricted. Originally, he could easily teleport through time and space, but now, he needed 10 times the power to achieve the same effect. He could have used it. At this moment, the might of the space-time shattering attack couldn't be unleashed. Even his own speed, due to the toughness of space and time, it was greatly restricted. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan wasn't worried at all. Instead, he felt relieved. However, the world of lightning before him had resolved his greatest worry. It had to be known that the battlefield between Luo Fan and the God Emperor's avatar was in the middle of the central civilization nation. In that place, if any energy fluctuations were to leak out, the entire civilized country would be destroyed. It was an absolute disaster. Even though there were already dozens of pseudo-saints guarding the entire civilized country, the pseudo-saints did not care. In the face of existences like Luo Fan and the God Emperor, they were just ant. Any fluctuation from their battle was enough to easily wipe out these false saints and destroy this entire civilized country. This was not a conjecture without any evidence. In fact, back then, when Luo Fan first came into contact with the Tsar, the little bit of will that the Tsar had transmitted had easily suppressed the entire civilized country and all the false saints in this civilized country. Hadn't he directly rescued all the living beings that had been sealed in this civilized country by Luo Fan? Compared to the current Luo Fan, the Tsar in the past was much more influential. Compared to the current Divine Emperor, there was a huge gap. Even the Tsar was able to achieve this with just a little bit of his willpower. Could it be that Luo Fan and the Emperor God could not do it? Could it be that their clones could not compare to the Tsar's willpower? It was precisely because he knew that the battle between him and the Divine Emperor's spiritual light clone would have a high chance of completely destroying the entire central civilized country that Luo Fan was a little restrained in the previous battle. As a result, he fell into a disadvantageous position. But now, with this lightning world, the situation was different. This lightning world was created by this world, and it was obviously completely targeted at the battle between the two of them. In such a world, any battle between them could only destroy the world in front of them. It was no longer a threat to the central civilized country in the outside world. In this way, however, he was already able to use his own attacks without any scruples. At this moment, in the civilized country, there was originally a towering mountain that pierced the clouds, but now it had been razed to the ground, leaving only the gray scene produced by the collision of two beams of spiritual light. In the pitch-black tribulation cloud that was flashing with lightning, a series of rumbling sounds rang out. Amidst the rumbling sounds, bolts of lightning constantly fell from the sky and blasted into the two beams of spiritual light that existed in the center of the tribulation cloud that was above Luo Fan. Although the lightning in the center was not big, only the size of a ping-pong ball, it was extremely dazzling. The blue light that it emitted had even reached a dazzling level. This spark was none other than the manifestation of the world of thunder. In other words, it wasn't lightning within the lightning, but a boundless world where the stability of time and space had reached an inconceivable level. At this moment, the endless lightning bolts continuously bombarded the lightning. Every time a bolt of lightning blasted into it, the lightning would flash slightly, as if the light had suddenly become a little more dazzling. At the same time, the lightning world inside instantly became a little stronger because of this. The stability of time and space within it also grew a little bit because of this. Of course, the speed of this growth was quite slow. It had even reached the point where Luo Fan and the Divine Emperor could barely perceive it. However, although this speed was slow, it was still constantly growing and changing. If this continued for a long time, the final result would be extremely shocking. Oh no! At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He could clearly feel that every time a bolt of lightning entered this lightning world, it would cause an inexplicable change. This fact suddenly made him feel an inexplicable worry in his heart. Now, the stability of time and space in this lightning world had already reached such an unbelievable level. If it continued to grow like this, how far would its limit grow in the end? Would it really seal the clones of the two emperors in this world? And when this world was completely destroyed, would the destructive power produced directly destroy the two of them? At this moment, he noticed that the woman in front of him, the Divine Emperor, was also frowning slightly. Luo Fan instantly knew that she also felt the same about his conjecture. Could it be that this is also her first time encountering such a lightning world? An incredible thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. In front of him was such a powerful round hammer with such a terrifying attack power. Obviously, this was not the first time she had used it. Normally speaking, she should have encountered the tribulation produced by this round hammer countless times. How could this be the first time she encountered such a tribulation? Countless thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. In the end, with a flash of inspiration, he discovered the key point. It seems that it must be because she used this round hammer to attack in this central civilized country that this tribulation appeared. That's right, that must be it. After figuring this out, an inexplicable smile suddenly appeared on Luo Fan's face. This central civilized country was the source of the new protagonist of this world. In the eyes of this world, this civilized country clearly had a special meaning and a rather important position. Under such circumstances, this round hammer that could cause great damage to the world appeared here. Naturally, it would incite an even more intense reaction from the heavens and the earth. In the end, this tribulation that was many times stronger than before and had never appeared before appeared. That was very normal. Fellow Taoist, you must have realized it too, right? Luo Fan said to the Divine Emperor with a smile. The Divine Emperor had already frowned, and a hint of anxiety could be seen in her eyes. A trace of anxiety could be seen in her eyes, but at this moment, when Luo Fan suddenly opened his mouth, her expression suddenly changed. Humph! No matter what, this avatar of yours must be destroyed. She spat out these words. Immediately after, the round hammer suddenly began to shake violently. The aura emitted from its body, as it began to grow crazily, in the blink of an eye. It had grown tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Such an aura was so powerful that it was beyond imagination. In the void, they directly constructed countless world clusters, turning the entire world of thunder and lightning into a pile of countless world clusters. This thunder world was originally vast and boundless. But at this moment, it was suddenly filled with countless world clusters, making it seem many times more mysterious than before. Each of the world clusters had countless worlds within them, and in each world there was an endless spacetime, and in each spacetime there was an endless expanse of land, and on that land there were countless living beings. It could be said that under this aura, the thunder world in front of him had become even more vast and complex than Earth's universe in the blink of an eye. Even the number of living beings in it had increased. Just the leaking aura alone had such a terrifying effect. The increase in the strength of the round hammer itself was obviously even more astonishing. Puft, 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 as muffled sounds rang out, the spiraling spiritual light river released by Luo Fan was crushed by the pressure of the round hammer. Countless fragments of spiritual light scattered in all directions and splashed into the aura of the countless world clusters. These spiritual lights themselves were existences with boundless power. Even if they had been broken into pieces, they didn't change their terrifying power. After splashing into the world clusters, these spiritual lights naturally evolved and turned into a motionless Luo Fan, and they began to slaughter and destroy the world clusters. Due to the different flow of time, they seemed to have gone through an unknown amount of time in a few breaths of time. They directly destroyed the world clusters, slaughtering all the worlds, space-time, and living beings within them, causing the world clusters to disappear one after another. The thunder world gradually reappeared. After the spiritual lights, transformed into Luo Fan, destroyed the world clusters, they seemed to have absorbed boundless power and obtained great growth. All of them seemed to have absorbed boundless power, and they had grown tremendously. Every speck of spiritual light seemed to have grown several times larger than before. Just like that, the countless spiritual lights grew. In the end, they gathered together, causing all of the spiritual light to grow several times stronger. After the spiritual lights transformed into Luo Fan grew, they completely lost their original form and gathered toward the center, gathering on the spiraling spiritual light river that hadn't broken yet. In the end, the spiritual light river continued to grow and expand. Gradually, it became whole again. Then, it gradually surpassed its original peak. After such growth and strengthening, the spiraling spiritual light river once again collapsed under the impact of the round hammer. Once again, it turned into spiritual lights and splashed everywhere, crashing into the consulate's world clusters. Although the world clusters had been slaughtered by the spiritual lights transformed into Luo Fan and their power had been completely absorbed, the aura of the round hammer was endless. Even if the world clusters were slaughtered, they could recover in the blink of an eye with the replenishment of aura. Thus, the scene of the Thunder World that had reappeared was once again engulfed by the endless aura of the world clusters. Once again, they transformed into Luo Fan and slaughtered and destroyed those worlds. These aura worlds became more and more powerful because of the aura emitted by the round hammer, so the creatures in these worlds also became more and more powerful. Their resistance to the Luo Fan formed by the spirit light also became stronger. Under such resistance, the spiritual lights transformed into Luo Fan faced the speed of the destruction of the world clusters. However, it was not as straightforward and fast as before. It took a much longer time than before for the entire group of worlds to be completely annihilated, and only then did the world of lightning reappear once more. Facing all these changes, the God Emperor's expression turned extremely unsightly. The aura of the world clusters were originally changes that evolved naturally from aura. In a battle between existences of the God Emperor's level, they wouldn't have much effect. Therefore, the God Emperor had never seen any existences of the same level fight against the aura of the world clusters. And yet, this unruly newbie before him could actually utilize the worlds that had evolved from his aura to such an extent, using them to restore his shattered aura, and even using the power of his own attack to restore himself and even strengthen himself. This filled the God Emperor's heart with an indescribable resentment. He's actually toying with me like this? That was the only thought in her mind. With this thought in mind, she raised her hand at Luo Fan again without hesitation. In an instant, the countless spiritual lights that had been separated from her body converged again and changed again. In the blink of an eye, another round hammer was formed. After this round hammer appeared, she instantly blasted it at Luo Fan. Condensing two round hammers that were equivalent to powerful pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures at the same time obviously brought great pressure to the God Emperor. At this moment, her body had already become somewhat translucent. Even her expression was extremely fatigued at this moment. It was as if that little trick just now had completely drained all of her strength, all of her energy, and even all of her mental strength. This new round hammer was different from the previous round hammer that had exposed its aura. Instead, it maintained the completely restrained state that the round hammer had when it first appeared, without the slightest aura leaking out. In the process of blasting at Luo Fan, there was no change in the void. It felt like an extremely small and ordinary stone was directly thrown at Luo Fan. However, with the appearance of this round hammer, the tribulation clouds above the thunderous world in the outside world suddenly became thicker by about one-fold. This thickening caused the originally pitch-black tribulation clouds to actually become slightly brighter at this moment. It seemed that things had almost reached a state where they would move in the opposite direction when they reached an extreme. The anger that was transmitted from the tribulation clouds also became more and more obvious. It directly attracted the attention of all the powerful living beings in this civilized country. In the blink of an eye, figures stepped out from various hidden cave abodes in the civilized country. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived around the tribulation clouds and looked at them from afar. These figures were naturally the false saints of this civilized country. To these false saints, everything that was happening in front of them had completely exceeded their understanding. The power contained in the tribulation clouds that had accumulated in the sky had already shocked them. Under that power, they could only feel how insignificant they were. A fear that they had not felt for a long time, a fear that had only appeared before they became false saints, once again occupied their minds. This made all of them look solemn. That enemy seems to be stronger than I imagined. Such thoughts flashed through the minds of the false saints at the same time. The enemy that Luo Fan had encountered. All the false sages here already knew about this. After all, the scale of the battle between Luo Fan and the God Emperor was enough to completely destroy the entire civilized country if any of the aftershocks leaked out. How could it not be discovered by the false sanctum in this civilized country? However, all along they had absolute confidence in their Creator's master. They did not think that the enemy could defeat him and cause damage to this civilized country. Therefore, they did not appear just now and only paid attention to it occasionally. However, the sudden change in the tribulation clouds in the sky finally broke their confidence and made them suddenly realize. Perhaps the situation was not as optimistic as they had imagined. It was also because they understood this that they appeared here at the same time. He will definitely be able to win, one of the false saints said. Of this, no one has any doubts. However, it's hard to say when he'll be able to win and whether he'll cause damage to the country in the process. Another pseudo-sage said. Let's set up a defensive formation here together, another false saint suddenly suggested. Upon hearing this, the dozens of false saints pondered for a moment and agreed at the same time. Just as they were discussing, in the sky, the tribulation clouds that had already reached the level where things would move in the opposite direction had already blasted out thousands of waves of lightning. These lightning bolts did not miss a single one and directly poured into the world of lightning. Of course, although the lightning bolts did not miss a single one, it did not mean that they did not cause any damage to the surroundings. In fact, although the lightning itself did not cause any damage to the world, just the anger emitted by the tribulation clouds and the entire process of the lightning bolts striking down had already caused indescribable damage to the space-time of this world. The space-time, nomological laws, and even the mysteries of the true saint and the great Tao fragments within the range of the tribulation clouds already had a punishing characteristic at this moment. Under the shroud of this characteristic, all the vitality in space-time was extracted and transformed, gradually turning into this punishing characteristic. After this characteristic appeared, it continued to spread, affecting a larger and larger range. And after space-time and so on were transformed into the punishing characteristic, the many false saints felt that it no longer belonged to this civilized country. Their strength could no longer reach this range. Their protection could no longer cover this range. This situation was obviously the most unacceptable change for these false saints. This meant that the safety of all existences in these areas could no longer be guaranteed. This change finally made the dozens of false saints make up their minds. They exchanged countless thoughts in an instant. Almost in the blink of an eye, they had already determined the method of setting up the formation and determined the task of each false saint. Although these false saints were as weak as ants in the eyes of Luo Fan and the others, they were false saints after all. There was no need to mention their profound wisdom and extensive knowledge. Creating a large formation that was suitable for the current situation was not a difficult task for them at all. After confirming all of this, they naturally began to take action. The power of countless false saints began to surge, and the surrounding world began to gradually change. All sorts of incredible light and shadows and incredible sounds appeared continuously. Amidst this change, an incomparably huge formation that completely enveloped the area where the tribulation clouds were gradually formed around the tribulation clouds and gradually took effect. As a result, the spreading punishing characteristics were gradually suppressed. Chapter 16:19. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face. B. In the Thunderbolt world, neither Luo Fan nor the Divine Emperor paid attention to what was happening outside the Thunderbolt world. At this moment, the God Emperor's body had become extremely illusory. It felt as if he would collapse and disappear in the next moment. On the opposite side, less than 100 meters away, Luo Fan's spirit light avatar's expression changed greatly. At this time, his double spiral spirit light river blocked around Hammer. On the other side, there was a round hammer that was hurtling towards him. The round hammer that was blocked by the double spiral spirit light river emitted a powerful aura. These auras formed endless worlds, countless spacetime, and countless creatures were born. In contrast, the other round hammer slowly pressed toward Luo Fan without any aura. Originally, Luo Fan was already struggling to resist the round hammer that was resisting the spirit light river. Spirit light splashed everywhere. Although he quickly absorbed enough energy from the aura worlds to recover, he was still at a disadvantage. Even if his recovery speed was fast, he still couldn't change this disadvantageous situation. Under such circumstances, with the sudden addition of a round hammer, it was obvious how much more dangerous it would be. At this moment, Luo Fan instinctively released 2 long rivers of spiritual light from his body, once again forming a long river in the shape of a double helix, directly blocking the newly appeared round hammer. The round hammer. It directly came into contact with the new spiraling river of spiritual light. Crack, 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 countless shattering sounds rang out. The essence of the double spiral spirit light river wasn't much different from before. Under the attack of the new round hammer, the situation was naturally not much different from before. It continued to shatter. Because the essence of the spirit light didn't decrease, the shattered spirit light naturally flew into the surrounding aura worlds and slaughtered them. At first glance, the situation seemed no different from before. But at this moment it had already become blurry. The Divine Emperor, who felt as if he would disappear at any moment, had a faint smile on his face. It was as if the current situation was good for her. At the same time, Luo Fan's body became blurry. His expression became quite ugly. There was no other reason for this. Although everything else had multiplied, the aura that was being emitted from the round hammer was extremely terrifying. But it didn't increase. There were still so many of those auras. In other words, there were only as many aura worlds as before. Under such circumstances, the amount of aura that Luo Fan could absorb and restore was naturally reduced by 1-fold. Clearly, the spirit light had absorbed the power of the aura world cluster to recover itself and condensed on the long river of spirit light. This was the entire recovery process of the spiritual light river condensed by Luo Fan. Now that this process had been weakened, it could be expected that these 2 spiraling rivers of spiritual light would naturally become weaker and weaker. In the end, it was very likely that they would lose their current stalemate and naturally sink into the abyss of failure. After discovering this, how could Luo Fan's complexion be good? Die. The Divine Emperor's face was full of complacency. Why? Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, because of the replenishment of the new lightning, the world of thunder in front of him was more than 100 times stronger than before. If it was before, his main body could still inject spirit light into this world of thunder to replenish the consumption of his spirit light clone. Then, now, all the connection between his spirit light clone and his main body had been completely cut off. Now, whether it was his main body or his clone, it was already impossible for him to transfer power and spirit light between the two of them. In other words, now that the spirit light clone had consumed too much power, it could only rely on its own power to continue fighting with the Divine Emperor in front of it. Apart from this, there was no other way. Your subordinate made a mistake, so you naturally have to take responsibility, the Divine Emperor said coldly. He made a mistake? What mistake did he make? Fellow Taoist, can you tell me directly? I'm completely at a loss right now. Luo Fan sighed. He didn't think too much about the Divine Emperor's logic. In this world, there were naturally many arrogant people who disdained to argue with ants. As long as the ants offended them, they would naturally blame the ants' master. Just like the Divine Emperor right now. The one who made the mistake was clearly Guizhou, not Luo Fan. However, the Divine Emperor completely disdained to argue with Guizhou. Instead, he blamed the mistake on Luo Fan and wanted Luo Fan to give him an explanation. It was like a child offending an adult, and the adult directly dragged the child to the child's parents to reason with them. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the divine emperor said coldly, "Are you still not willing to make a divination?" Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, "I can't split my attention now. Since fellow Taoist already knows, why don't you just say it directly?" "Can't split your attention? Since you can't split your attention, then I'll beat you until you do." When the God King saw that Luo Fan was still talking like this even after the meeting, he couldn't help but feel even more displeased. As she spoke, she directly manipulated the two round hammers to vibrate slightly. In an instant, the two forces communicated with each other, and an incomparably terrifying aura was suddenly emitted from the two round hammers. This aura was different from the aura from before. The aura from before was emitted by the characteristics of the round hammers, and it belonged to a type of existence of the round hammers. But this aura was different. This aura was the inclination of the round hammers. It was the spirituality of the round hammers that was exerting its strength and developing hostility towards Luo Fan, and was about to kill Luo Fan. In comparison, although the aura was grand and vast, it wouldn't have any lethality unless it was strong to a certain extent. But this aura was different. Regardless of whether it was the aura, as long as it was the aura, it would naturally have an extremely great pressure on the mind. If it was strong to a certain extent, it would directly crush the mind. It would directly completely erase the opponent from the source. Now, the aura emitted from the two round hammers, it already had the characteristic of completely erasing the source of life. Of course, this was only because of this characteristic. In fact, it also depended on the strength of the target of the aura. If the target of the aura was strong enough, for example, an existence at the level of Luo Fan, facing such an aura, he wouldn't feel the slightest bit of pressure. However, the two round hammers obviously didn't treat this aura as the main target of killing the enemy. This aura was actually just a side effect. At this moment, the two round hammers emitted an increasingly powerful fluctuation. This fluctuation controlled everything, including the aura of the surrounding world, all time, all space, and all laws. Even the great Tao in the dark was completely under control. As a result, everything within the range of this fluctuation, everything naturally changed. It changed into the state that the round hammers needed, the state that could unleash their full power. At this moment, the power of the round hammers seemed to have suddenly increased by who knows how many times. When Luo Fan looked over, it seemed like the round hammers had suddenly increased by many times. As the power of the two round hammers linked together, the two spiraling spirit light rivers that Luo Fan had blasted out suddenly seemed to have become many times weaker. The speed of the collapse suddenly sped up a little. To actually use such a magic treasure to set up a formation. At this moment, there wasn't the slightest bit of panic on Luo Fan's face. Instead, there was a kind of indescribable understanding. Formations were simple and complicated. There were those that required a lot of nodes and those that required few nodes. Although the two round hammers seemed so few, compared to a formation that easily had tens of thousands of nodes, it was so insignificant. But that didn't mean that the two round hammers couldn't form nodes. In fact, there were countless formations with two nodes. However, according to Luo Fan's understanding, any formation with two nodes was countless times weaker than the formation that the Divine Emperor had set up in front of him. Perhaps it was because of the power of the round hammers, but the formation that the two round hammers had set up gave him a strong sense of crisis. It seemed that even his life source couldn't bear the power of the formation at this moment. Under the formation, it began to tremble slightly, and there were even faint signs of it shivering. What a powerful formation! Although it can't compare to a true saint formation, it's the most suitable for the two round hammers in front of me. It can unleash the full power of the round hammers. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. At this moment, his eyes swept over the Divine Emperor. He found that the Divine Emperor's body was much more blurry than before, and even the size of his body had shrunk at this moment. With one look, it was obvious that the Divine Emperor was under a lot of pressure to set up this formation that was made up of two nodes. It was obvious that she had also paid a huge price. Is there a need for that? It's just a matter of you telling me and me deducing it myself. Luo Fan sighed. After hearing this, the Divine Emperor only revealed a disdainful sneer on his face. The Divine Emperor's face was so beautiful that almost all the details had reached an unchangeable state. Even his sneer revealed a kind of proud and awe-inspiring beauty. However, at this moment, Luo Fan didn't have any thoughts of appreciating beauty. All he felt was a headache. At this moment, it was obviously difficult to use the two spiraling spirit light rivers to fight against the two round hammers. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. In an instant, the two spiraling spirit light rivers collapsed with a loud bang. In the blink of an eye, they converged into two spirit lights that were completely opposite in nature. These two spirit lights communicated with each other and repelled each other, vaguely forming a double spiral again. However, if he waited for them to form a double spiral again, wouldn't that be similar to the state before? What kind of effect would there be if they were used to fight against the two round hammers that formed the formation? Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan directly manipulated these two spirit lights and began to disperse in the void. They began to reform, gradually forming a state that had never appeared before. In other words, it was a state that the spirit lights had never appeared before. It was an axe that was made up of countless details, and it shone with spiritual light. After such an axe appeared, it naturally emitted an unimaginable aura. It was the aura of opening. Looking at the appearance of this axe, it vaguely resembled a magic treasure that Luo Fan had obtained in the past. It looked like the heaven-splitting axe. At this moment, because the two spiraling spirit light rivers were no longer blocking it, the formation formed by the two round hammers increased in speed. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived in front of the heaven-splitting axe. It was about to crush the heaven-splitting axe. Suddenly, Luo Fan, who had become illusory, raised his hand and grabbed the air. The heaven-splitting axe instantly fell into his hand. In an instant, all the structure of the heaven-splitting axe, all the flowing spirit lights, and all the power communication and transformation states poured into his heart without reservation. This heaven-splitting axe was made up of two completely different spirit lights. Although it looked like an axe on the surface, as if it was just shaped by the spirit lights, in fact, it was unknown how many billions of parts there were inside. Or rather, it was unknown how many billions of unknown Tao patterns there were. It was these parts and these Tao patterns. They formed the heaven-splitting axe. Between each part and each Tao pattern, there were two spirit lights of almost completely opposite nature. These two spirit lights reinforced and restrained each other, existing in a wonderful interaction that couldn't be described with words. Endless power constantly emitted from this interaction. It was also this kind of power that made the entire heaven-splitting axe become a complete entity. This made the heaven-splitting axe possess unimaginable power. Although it's not perfect, compared to the previous method of using spirit lights, it's already countless times better. It's already countless times better. Luo Fan sighed with emotion. The reason why he could transform the spirit lights into this heaven-splitting axe was very simple. It was the inspiration he got from the Divine Emperor in front of him at this moment. Don't forget that the two round hammers condensed by the Divine Emperor were unbelievably powerful, even triggering endless tribulations from heaven and earth to construct this world of thunder and lightning. However, the essence of the two round hammers was still spirit lights. It was just that she transformed the spirit lights and made them form magic treasures. Since the Divine Emperor could do this, why couldn't Luo Fan do the same? When it came to refining magic treasures, Luo Fan felt that he wasn't any worse than anyone else. At this moment, this heaven-splitting axe was naturally constructed by him in that instant of inspiration just now, and the effect was much better than what he had expected. At the very least, he felt that the power of this heaven-splitting axe was more powerful than the combined power of the two round hammers. Sure enough, it's worthy of being a magical weapon constructed from two spiritual lights of opposite natures. As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan suddenly flipped his axe and instantly brandished it, as if it could split the heavens and earth. At this moment, outside the world of thunder and lightning, the tribulation cloud above the void shook violently. With a soft swoosh, an invisible existence that came out of nowhere suddenly cut a long crack in the tribulation cloud, directly from the bottom all the way to the top, completely cutting apart the tribulation cloud that was tens of thousands of kilometers thick. Around this crack, countless lightning bolts tried to break through the barrier and converge with the tribulation cloud on the opposite side. However, there seemed to be an invisible barrier between the two. No matter how they collided, it didn't budge at all and didn't change at all. It was as if time and space had been separated wherever the mark passed by. In a trance, it was as if a huge heaven-splitting axe had directly opened up an incomparably huge gap in the middle, directly creating a vast and boundless world. Because of this change, the tribulation cloud suddenly thickened. The lightning bolts that struck down from it were more than 10 times more powerful than before. The frequency of the lightning strikes just now. The intensity had already created such a huge pressure on the surroundings. Now, everything had increased by more than 10 times. In an instant, the defensive formation set up by the dozens of pseudo-saints was completely broken by the bit of power that leaked out from the lightning. Amidst the crackling and rumbling sounds, the world became bright and clear. Immediately after, indescribable vibrations spread out from the middle and began to surge in all directions like waves. At the location where the waves appeared, all spacetime and all the mysteries of the true saint, all the fragments of the great Tao were completely shattered. It was as if countless mists had suddenly appeared in the world. Facing such a change, the expressions of the dozens of pseudo-saints changed drastically. Almost instinctively, they directly blocked in front of the wave and unleashed their own strength. In front of the wave, they built a huge dam with great difficulty and combined it together, wanting to stop the wave. At this moment, the wave paused for a moment. However, it was only for a moment. In the next moment, the dam built by the many pseudo-saints was directly shattered. At the same time, those pseudo-saints exploded one after another. In the blink of an eye, they were all turned into dust and completely disappeared from this world. Oh no! A cry of alarm came from the sky. Immediately after, dozens of pseudo-saints condensed again and appeared in front of the wave. A huge dam once again blocked in front of the wave. These pseudo-saints were still the pseudo-saints that had exploded and turned into dust. The reason why they could resurrect and descend in an instant was very simple. They were the pseudo-saints of this civilized country. As long as this civilized country was not completely destroyed, they would be eternal and indestructible, even if they were directly blown into dust. They could also very quickly rely on the power of this civilized country to resurrect. It was precisely because of this that they could appear here at this time. It was also precisely because of this that they were so determined to block in front of the wave. That wave could even completely shatter false saints like them. It was self-evident how powerful it was. If they ignored it and allowed it to rush everywhere, allowing it to directly engulf the entire civilized country, then their fate just now would be the fate of the civilized country. Evidently, it was impossible for a civilized country to be revived after being destroyed like they were. In this case, it would instead affect them and cause them to lose this eternal and indestructible characteristic. Under the wave, they would die without being able to resist. This time, when these pseudo-saints were in front of the wave, they did not directly build a dam to block it like before. After all, that was already a method that had been proven to be unable to resist. At this moment, countless runes flashed on their bodies. From that inexplicable place, wisps of power were summoned and began to fuse with these runes and their power. They vaguely formed a huge array formation that blocked in front of the wave. This time, the array formation was much stronger than the original dam. It lasted for more than 10 breaths before it was broken. At this moment, the dozens of pseudo-sages were also broken through. The moment the array formation was broken, the dozens of pseudo-saints exploded from the inside out and turned into dust immediately after. Before the wave could reach the remains of these pseudo-saints, the figures of these pseudo-saints tore through the air and appeared in front of the wave again. Clearly, he had also revived from the brink of death and returned to this place with the same speed as before to continue blocking the frightening wave in front of him. The previous array formation was already the limit that these pseudo-saints could build. Although it was still possible for them to build a stronger defensive array formation, it would require an extremely large amount of time to deduce and create it before they could succeed in the end. And now what they lacked was time. Therefore, these pseudo-saints could only follow the previous method and continue to guide the inexplicable power to descend and continue to build the array formation. After holding on for more than 10 breaths, they were directly turned into dust by the wave. After that, they would resurrect and continue to build the array formation, continuing to hold on for more than 10 breaths. Just like that, the cycle repeated, using an extremely tragic method to resist the wave and prevent it from destroying the entire civilized country. Unfortunately, the wave was not just a single wave. In fact, the fundamental reason for the wave was because the lightning from the tribulation cloud kept striking down and blasting into the world of lightning. As a result, as long as the tribulation didn't subside and the lightning didn't stop striking down, the waves would never stop and would never subside. Chapter 16:20. While the dozens of false sages in the central country were resisting the waves in extreme pain, Luo Fan and the God Emperor did not extend their senses to the outside world in the lightning world. At this moment, Luo Fan held the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe in his hand and swung it at the divine emperor. This axe was like the axe that Pangu had used to open up the primordial world in the state of chaos. It seemed to have broken the state of chaos in an instant. There seemed to be clear and turbid chi being generated in it, and there seemed to be endless unbelievable existences being born in it. The axe, which seemed to be able to split the heavens and the earth, went straight for the round hammer that the divine emperor had formed into 2 nodes of the formation. At this moment, an indescribable look of surprise appeared in the divine emperor's eyes. Obviously, the method that Luo Fan used now was beyond her imagination. Back then, she had spent trillions of time from obtaining the spiritual light to condensing it into a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure to strengthen her attack power. And now, Luo Fan had condensed the spiritual light into a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure so easily in front of her. Moreover, it was not an ordinary spiritual light, but the condensation of 2 types of spiritual light with completely opposite natures. This method had almost subverted her worldview. How could she face it calmly? However, although she couldn't calm down, she was still in existence known as the Emperor after all. She didn't hesitate to deal with it. In an instant, the extremely strange formation formed by the 2 round hammers began to operate at high speed. Its power had also increased by several times in the blink of an eye. Rings of strange fluctuations instantly surged out from the top of it. These fluctuations seemed to be heaven and earth, but they were fundamentally different from heaven and earth. As it swept past, even the space-time of the lightning world distorted. It looked like it had turned into ordinary plasticine. It no longer had the characteristic of being unshakable even when the 2 of them fought with all their might. Such a formation instantly collided with the heaven-splitting axe's cleave that could split the heavens and the earth. In an instant. In a situation where there was no movement at all, the heaven-splitting axe directly cleaved into the formation. During this process, the 2 round hammers became even more chaotic. The combination of the 2 forces instantly sank from its original flawless state. An increasingly powerful chaos directly appeared between the 2 forces. In this chaos, the power of the two round hammers that were originally cooperating with each other clashed. Such conflicts were minimal at first, but as time went on, they grew more and more intense. Instead, it began to grow rapidly. In the end, when the axe directly broke through the entire formation, this conflict had already reached its limit. Boom, 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 boom. An unimaginably shocking upheaval occurred in an instant. Countless destructive forces swept out in all directions, instantly engulfing the entire lightning world. In that instant, the entire world of thunder and lightning lost all sense of existence except for the ripples. In the blink of an eye, the only thing left in the entire lightning world was this endless destructive power. At that instant, a crack gradually appeared. From the point of impact of the axe, in the blink of an eye, it traversed the entire lightning world. Under this crack, everything in the world of lightning had disappeared, including the destructive power. It was no longer possible to enter it. One after another, the endless number of worlds appeared in that crack. These worlds, one by one, were similar to the power in the aura world group and the rippling world. They were fundamentally different from the shaking world. The various worlds from before seemed like temporary worlds. It looked like a temporary world. As long as the power was extracted, as long as the aura, waves, and vibrations disappeared, those worlds would naturally collapse and disappear completely, as if they had never existed in the first place. However, the worlds that appeared in these cracks were different. These new worlds were permanent. At least, they weren't temporary worlds. Such worlds wouldn't disappear just because the heaven-splitting axe left. They wouldn't disappear just because the power of the heaven-splitting axe was extracted. Instead, they would exist for a long time without any external demands. As long as no power came to destroy them, it could be said that such a world could already be considered a real and extremely perfect world. In this world, endless living beings were constantly born and began to grow rapidly. Not long after, cultivators had already appeared due to the difference in the flow of time, and they were becoming more and more powerful. By the time Luo Fan put away the spiritual light axe, pseudo-saints had already begun to be born in those worlds. There were even pseudo-saints in some worlds that had begun to break through to the pseudo-saint realm. So powerful! At this moment, the Divine Emperor spat out her last words. Immediately after, her body shook, and from the very beginning, she turned into ashes bit by bit. Not long after, she completely disappeared as if she had never appeared. Along with the disappearance of the Divine Emperor, the two round hammers that she had condensed also began to gradually turn into powder. In the end, they slowly disappeared without a trace. Not long after, they completely disappeared as if they had never appeared. At this moment, Luo Fan was floating in the void, watching the entire process of the Divine Emperor and the round hammers she had condensed disappear. He sighed and said, "Why bother?" As he spoke, his body also began to gradually disappear. However, just before his body completely disappeared, the spiritual light-splitting axe in his hand did not disappear like the Divine Emperor's round hammers. Instead, it began to riot. The spiritual light-splitting axe contained two almost completely opposite spiritual light. After losing the suppression of Luo Fan's body, they began to rebel. In an instant, the two kinds of spiritual lights had an extremely fierce battle. In an instant, an intense battle broke out between the two types of spiritual light. This kind of struggle was happening in every tiny part of the machine. It happened in every tiny Tao pattern. When this battle broke out, the entire heaven-splitting axe instantly lost its original form. It looked as if there was a strange thing that began to grow and expand inside, as if it was going to break the entire heaven-splitting axe. At the beginning of this change, one could barely see the original form of the heaven-splitting axe. But in a short while, the heaven-splitting axe had already turned into a ball of light. There were two kinds of light that were constantly fighting within it. A ball of light that was constantly clashing. Immediately after, the entire world of lightning began to shake violently. The shaking was so intense. It simply seemed as if this world of lightning wasn't a place that was formidable to the point of resisting monarch realm battles, and it had become an extremely ordinary world that even a connate golden immortal realm cultivator could easily obliterate and destroy. Facing such a world, there was only an indescribable expression on Luo Fan's face. Crack, 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 crack. The crisp sounds were so conspicuous even in the midst of the terrifying shaking and shocking vibrations. Then, cracks appeared in every inch of the void of the entire world of lightning, making it seem as if the world was completely formed by the accumulation of countless tiny fragments. The cracks became more and more obvious and denser as the ball of light that the heaven-splitting axe had turned into grew. In the end, the ball of light that the heaven-splitting axe had turned into finally exploded. When it turned into countless tiny fragments of spiritual light, the entire world of lightning finally collapsed. The collapse of the world of lightning. Naturally, everything outside of the lightning world had already been revealed. In other words, in an instant, the countless lightning bolts that were madly pouncing towards the world of lightning were revealed. At the same time, it was also caused by the lightning. The destruction of time and space was also revealed. At this moment, the tiny bit of Luo Fan's spiritual light clone that was left saw everything around it. It actually became like this. Such a thought instantly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan's spiritual light doppelganger didn't leave a single trace behind. All of his attention and mind naturally returned to his body. The consequence of the collapse of the world of lightning was that everything within it collapsed and was destroyed at the same time. In other words, the moment the world of lightning completely collapsed and was destroyed, the extremely perfect world that had been created by Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven-splitting axe and could exist for a long time also collapsed and was completely destroyed at the same time. At this moment, in the ruins of the world of lightning, not a single trace was left. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the sky suddenly underwent a huge change. As if the source of the tribulation had been lost, the extremely dense and dazzling tribulation clouds in the sky began to quickly disperse. Even the endless lightning that struck down from the tribulation clouds also began to gradually disappear at this moment, as if they had never appeared. However, the dissipation of the tribulation clouds did not mean that everything in the tribulation clouds had dissipated. In fact, when Luo Fan swung the heaven-splitting axe, the huge crack that had appeared through the entire tribulation clouds and caused a huge hole to appear in the tribulation clouds was still there. It was simply like a natural landscape engraved in the void and showed no signs of dissipating. At this moment, the dozens of false saints finally blocked the wave for the first time. In other words, for the first time, when their defensive methods were destroyed, they didn't die along with their bodies and get smashed into smithereens by the wave. Instead, they had the powerful ability to easily reassemble their defenses and instantly stand in front of the wave again. Although it did not take long for the defensive formation to shatter once again, it was already able to last for a much longer period of time than it had originally been. At this moment, all the false saints looked extremely happy. Although this change seemed to still be unable to completely eliminate the wave at this moment, it did not seem to be a decisive change. However, as long as one noticed that the wave was already gradually reducing, this was enough to make them feel excited and let them know that the hope of victory was right in front of them. This process lasted for nearly 2 hours. After nearly 2 hours, all the waves subsided, and the center of the wave, which was the place that had been constantly struck by the tribulation clouds, also appeared in front of the false saints again. How can this be? Didn't this mountain disappear before? When he saw the scene inside clearly, he was stunned. When they saw the scene inside, these false saints could not help but exclaim. However, the scene that appeared in front of them was completely beyond their imagination. Because, in front of them, the towering mountain peak that pierced into the clouds, the mountain peak that was the holy land of the entire civilized country, had actually reappeared at this moment. On the surface, it seemed to be the same as before. It was completely the same without any difference. However, the feeling inside was even more mysterious and inconceivable than before. Such a strange change made them wonder if they had turned back time. No, the previous destruction was a change that destroyed time as well. Even if time was reversed, it was impossible for this mountain peak and everything on it to be completely restored. What exactly is going on? These false saints muttered. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the original palace, did not care about what these false saints were doing. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on his face. This mountain peak had indeed been completely destroyed in the battle between him and the divine emperor. The reason why it appeared again and behaved exactly the same as before was very simple. The reason was very simple. It was because Luo Fan had recreated it. However, the method Luo Fan used to create this mountain peak was completely different from the method he used to create other mountains and even other worlds. This time, he created this mountain peak. Just like how he had condensed the heaven-splitting axe previously, he used spiritual light to directly construct this mountain peak. In other words, at this moment there was a battle here. This mountain peak looked like an ordinary mountain peak, but in fact there were two spiritual lights condensed by Luo Fan inside. These two types of spirit light were divided into countless tiny parts and gathered together to form the mountain. They formed all the buildings on the mountain, making the mountain look no different from the original mountain. There was no difference at all. Of course, although the method he used to construct this mountain peak was similar to the method he used to construct the heaven-splitting axe, it was not completely the same. Back then, when he constructed the heaven-splitting axe, he used the construction method of a pseudo-primordial chaos numinous treasure. The heaven-splitting axe that was constructed in this way contained incredible energy, so it naturally became a one-time use pseudo-primordial chaos numinous treasure. Once such an existence appeared, it would naturally pose a huge threat to the surrounding heaven and earth, which would then trigger a reaction from heaven and earth, causing the heaven and earth to naturally descend a tribulation. If such a method was used on this mountain peak, it would simply be courting death. After all, this mountain peak was where Luo Fan lived. Occasionally, he would have to move to another place when a tribulation came. If he really used this method to condense it, it would attract tribulation all the time. How could he live his life then? Therefore, at this moment, this mountain peak did not have any other special effect. All it had was sturdiness and toughness. For a mountain peak that was suitable for living, having these two characteristics was already enough. The effect of combining the spiritual lights into a mountain peak, apart from allowing the mountain peak to return, was that this directly prevented the two conflicting spiritual lights from spreading and hurting the entire civilized country. At this moment, Luo Fan was still constantly integrating these two rays of light, trying to integrate them into his own worldview. This integration process could indeed reduce and weaken the intensity of the conflict between these two completely different spiritual light. However, this reduction and weakening still required a process. Before he could completely unify these two kinds of spiritual lights, the conflict between these two spiritual lights would absolutely not disappear. In other words, before this, if Luo Fan was not careful, what awaited him would be the power of these spiritual lights leaking out and instantly destroying the entire civilized country. To Luo Fan, this was obviously a problem. It was a process that would add trouble to his task of integrating these two spiritual lights. But now, naturally, the situation was different. At this time, when he combined these two spiritual lights into this mountain peak, the conflict between the two spiritual lights would naturally be confined within this mountain peak. Naturally, it would be blocked by the existence of the same nature as the two spiritual lights. In the end, it would not really affect the world outside this mountain peak, and naturally, it would not affect the entire civilized country outside this mountain peak. Feeling this benefit, Luo Fan let out a long breath. He began to continue the integration process. As for what mistake Guizhou had made, what about the Divine Emperor? He didn't care at all. The reason why he did this was because he knew very well that the Divine Emperor would never let him go. Perhaps there was a time limit, but the Divine Emperor would definitely come here to find trouble with him, and not the Guizhou. This was decided by the pride in her heart. Since there was no problem with Guizhou, and the Divine Emperor's arrival was not much of a threat to him, he naturally didn't care. He just sat here and waited for her to come. All of a sudden, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He sensed an inexplicable gaze peering at him from somewhere. With a single glance, he already knew what kind of existence it was that was spying on him. He couldn't help but smile and say, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." This sentence spread far and wide. It was directly transmitted to the ears of the peeping existence. Hearing this voice, the existence who was peeping finally showed itself. It was the founder of the big organization, the Tsar. The Tsar sighed and said, "I didn't expect you to be so powerful. Could it be that you held back when we were sparring?" "Held back? Of course not. I even held back when I was fighting with you. Why would I do such a suicidal thing?" Luo Fan said with a smile. The Tsar heard this and sighed. "If you didn't hold back, it would be even more fearsome and terrifying. How long has it been since then? I can't believe you've already improved to such a level, and can even fight with a veteran emperor like the Divine Emperor. I didn't know you were so familiar with the Divine Emperor. Could you tell me more about him?" Luo Fan said with a smile. "You don't know the Divine Emperor?" the Tsar asked in disbelief. After witnessing the earth-shattering battle between Luo Fan and the Divine Emperor, the Tsar no longer felt any hostility toward Luo Fan. The reason was simple. If the two people's strength was close, the weaker one would naturally feel a strong sense of unwillingness and hostility toward the stronger one. However, when the two people's strength increased to a certain level and reached a level that the weaker one couldn't surpass no matter how hard he tried, the unwillingness and hostility would naturally disappear. In the past, although Luo Fan was stronger than the Tsar, there was a limit to his strength, which was why the Tsar was hostile toward him. But now, after Luo Fan defeated the Divine Emperor's clone, the Tsar clearly felt that the gap between him and Luo Fan was so huge that it was impossible for him to catch up. This hostility, of course, turned into another emotion, admiration. Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "The Divine Emperor? I've never heard of him." The Tsar said, "Since you don't know, I'll tell you." During the whole conversation, Luo Fan was still on the mountain peak formed by his spiritual light, while the Tsar was still in the void hundreds of millions of light years away. At such a distance, ordinary cultivators couldn't even sense each other, let alone talk. However, to Luo Fan and the Tsar, such a distance was no different from facing each other. Because of this, neither Luo Fan nor the Tsar had any intention of closing the distance. "Do you know that emperors are also divided into levels?" The Tsar thought for a while, but he didn't talk about the Divine Emperor directly. Instead, he talked about it from another angle. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan frowned slightly. The level of emperors? He had never heard of this before. "I don't know about this. Please enlighten me." Chapter 16:21. 3 Levels. Luo Fan had a faint guess in his heart when he heard this. Yes, there are 3 levels. Among them, those like me who haven't condensed divine light are the lowest level. Apart from that, those who can condense divine light are the 2nd level. Above this level is the 3rd level, which is also the highest level. I don't know what the requirements are. However, the Divine Emperor is obviously the 3rd level, the Tsar said with a sigh. Divine light. Luo Fan thought to himself. He had a vague feeling that the 3rd level might be related to condensing divine light into magic treasures. Of course, this was just a rough feeling. After thinking about this, he quickly came up with a reason to refute it. Condensing divine light into a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure did not seem very difficult. As long as one had the inspiration and the ability to control divine light, one could naturally condense divine light into magic treasures. From this point of view, condensing divine light into magic treasures did not seem to be enough to enter the third level. If that's the case, then what's the standard for the third level? This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the Tsar seemed to have sensed something. He said to Luo Fan, "I still have something to do, so I'll take my leave. Take care, my friend." As he spoke, his figure flashed and disappeared without a trace. Luo Fan was about to say something, but he found that the Tsar had already disappeared. He could not help but mutter to himself, "He left in a hurry. He did not even give me any time to react." However, soon, he thought of something and could not help but smile bitterly. As expected, at this moment, an incomparably powerful aura broke through the air and directly enveloped the mountain where he was. It made Luo Fan, who was in this mountain, feel that his life essence was under some kind of indescribable pressure. It was as if some unimaginable power had grabbed him and could crush him to death at any time. This feeling even reminded him of the feeling he had when he first sensed the Tsar's will. However, Luo Fan was completely different from before. Feeling the arrival of this aura, with a thought, the two divine lights around him trembled slightly. With a loud bang, the aura was completely shattered. In the blink of an eye, it left his body and could no longer be sensed by him. Then, a silhouette gradually appeared in the void above. This figure was quite familiar to Luo Fan. That beautiful face that could even make heaven and earth pale, and that dainty body. It was none other than the Divine Emperor, whose doppelganger had been destroyed by Luo Fan. "My friend, why bother?" Luo Fan said with a sigh. The Divine Emperor who came at this time was also a divine light. However, compared to the original doppelganger, the Divine Emperor, the divine light, the Emperor, was, and the divine Emperor, the divine Emperor. Naturally, he had already changed the weather around him, causing the space within a range of tens of thousands of kilometers to change. It was as if space was expanding and contracting as he breathed. The Divine Emperor's face was as gloomy as water. She floated high in the void and looked down, her eyes piercing through the layers of void. After passing through the barrier of the spiritual light, he directly saw Luo Fan, who was in the palace constructed by the spiritual light. "Could it be that you're still not willing to come out? Are you still not willing to come out personally?" The God Emperor looked at Luo Fan and said coldly. For some reason, Luo Fan vaguely sensed an inexplicable resentment in her words. Hearing this, Luo Fan could only smile bitterly. "My friend, it's not that I don't want to come out, but I have two conflicting divine lights and have to meditate to reconcile them. I can't come out at all." As he spoke, with a thought, two clones condensed from spiritual light instantly appeared in front of the Divine Emperor. Because the Divine Emperor's divine light clone was more than 10,000 times stronger than before, Luo Fan's divine light clone was also more than 10,000 times stronger. The Divine Emperor shouted coldly, "Disperse your divine light clone." Luo Fan frowned. "My friend, what do you mean? Now that you are a clone, I will also deal with it. What's wrong with that?" At this moment, Luo Fan was a bit impatient. It has to be said that although Gui Shou had offended the Divine Emperor in some way, ever since they met, he had been very polite. It could even be said that he had been wronged. However, the Divine Emperor was still pestering him and even used such a commanding tone. This was clearly a bit too much. Seeing this, the Divine Emperor said, "Who said this is my divine light clone? This is a part of my main body." Hearing this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He smiled helplessly. "Since fellow Taoist is using your main body, then I will deal with it." As he spoke, with a thought, the spiritual light avatar trembled and turned back into a ray of light. It merged into the large expanse of light below as if it had never appeared. The reason why Luo Fan dispersed the spirit light clones so straightforwardly was to appease the Divine Emperor, but it was more because this was just a trivial matter to him. Whether he had a divine light clone or not, it didn't affect his combat power much. If the Divine Emperor didn't have any hostile intentions, then everything would be the same. Even if the Divine Emperor wanted to attack him, it wouldn't be a problem. He could easily deal with it. Not to mention anything else, even if he wanted to condense a clone to deal with it, it would be an extremely easy task for him. It wouldn't affect his combat power. It was precisely because it wouldn't affect him that Luo Fan agreed so easily. Your subordinates have now subdued almost all the creatures under my command. They even changed the appearance of my territory. Don't you think you should give me an explanation for this? The Divine Emperor said coldly. At this time, she didn't mention asking Luo Fan to figure out what had happened. Obviously, at this time, she had already understood that Luo Fan was no longer like the Tsar who could be casually ordered around by her. He could give her random orders. Luo Fan, at least in a certain aspect, was qualified to stand on the same level as her. As a powerful being like the Divine Emperor, any sentence from him could contain endless information. Although she had only said one sentence, only a few dozen words however, when Luo Fan heard this, countless scenes and scenes instantly emerged in his mind. In an instant, he finally understood what was going on. For a moment, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. It turned out, over the years, Gui Shou had unknowingly visited all the civilized countries in the Realm Emperor's territory. He had also disintegrated all the schemes of the Realm Emperor's subordinates against those civilized countries, allowing those civilized countries to regain their freedom. Regaining their freedom. After that, Gui Shou and the others didn't stop. Instead, they continued to move forward and directly stepped into another territory, which belonged to the Divine Emperor. In the Divine Emperor's territory, the creature with the natural Taoism aptitude, who was also the new protagonist of this world, lived in the same state as in the Realm Emperor's territory. It was completely different from the creatures in the Tsar's territory. In the Divine Emperor's territory, all the civilized countries were in a state of slavery. That is to say, in this territory there was no one. Every civilized country was directly enslaved by the creatures under the Divine Emperor's command. In every civilized country, there was a creature of varying strength who occupied the highest position in that civilized country. He could take whatever he wanted from all the creatures in that civilized country, completely treating them as his own resources, in such an area. How could the Divine Emperor, who considered himself responsible for those civilized countries, let it go? At that moment, he directly attacked and defeated the creatures who had enslaved the civilized countries one by one. If that was all, then it was naturally because those creatures were not strong enough that they caused their own misfortune. The Divine Emperor wouldn't have cared too much, nor would he have felt offended. However, Gui Shou didn't stop while he was ahead. He actually re-enslaved the creatures who had enslaved the civilized countries. Then, in turn, he made these enslaved creatures directly attack other creatures. He began to capture more and more creatures to enlighten and enslave them. In the end, the number of creatures he enslaved increased. In the short span of a dozen years, he had almost completely enlightened and enslaved all the living beings within the vast and boundless territory of who knew how many billions of light years. This was like a turtledove occupying a magpie's nest, directly turning the Divine Emperor's territory into his own. How could the Divine Emperor bear such a thing? However, for the Divine Emperor, although Gui Shou was powerful, he wasn't even an emperor, so she didn't bother to argue with him. Therefore, she directly pushed the blame to Gui Shou's master, namely Luo Fan. That was why he had come to Luo Fan's place to cause trouble for him. Gui Shou, oh Gui Shou, you're too greedy. Even if you enlightened half of the creatures, I would still have something to say. Now, you've actually enlightened almost all living beings. This Luo Fan could only helplessly smile bitterly in his heart. Gui Shou was indeed quite unscrupulous in this matter. It should be noted that an emperor like the Divine Emperor didn't care about the creatures in his territory and didn't say that he would be a babysitter to all the creatures in his territory. However, this didn't mean that he could watch all the creatures in his territory become other people's slaves. In that case, as the owner of his territory, what kind of owner was he? Wouldn't he become a steward? However, although Luo Fan had this thought, he obviously couldn't directly admit that it was Gui Shou's fault. After all, Luo Fan wasn't lacking in the desire to protect his own people. Thus, Luo Fan's mind raced. Suddenly, he laughed and said, "So, it's because of this matter. This is a great thing for you, fellow Taoist. Why don't you thank me but come here to denounce me?" Great thing? The Divine Emperor was so angry that he laughed. Along with the change in her mind, the aura on her body began to surge crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had almost broken through the entire sky, directly changing the nature of the surrounding space-time, causing the surrounding space-time to rapidly distort, as if it had grown countless claws and teeth, ready to tear everything that stepped into its range to pieces. Just from the change in space-time alone, one could feel how powerful the anger in her heart was. Seeing this, Luo Fan wasn't moved at all. He smiled and said, "Of course it's a good thing." Seeing this, Luo Fan was not moved at all. He smiled and said, "Naturally, it's a good thing. Gui Shou has already enlightened almost all of the living beings under you. Obviously, this has allowed them to gain wisdom. From now on, they no longer look like muddle-headed beasts. Their nature has improved by leaps and bounds. Isn't this a good thing? Now, they don't recognize me as their master. Instead, they recognize your subordinates as their masters. Now, they no longer recognize me as their master. Instead, they recognize your subordinates as their masters. Now, they don't recognize me as their master, but your subordinates. What good thing is this?" As the Divine Emperor spoke, he became even angrier. The surrounding space-time changed. Because of this, it became more and more intense. Could it be that fellow Taoist has misunderstood? Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed and said, "Although they said that they don't recognize fellow Taoist as their master, although they say they don't recognize you as their master, that's just their attitude. Aren't they still the same in your hands? If fellow Taoists wanted to, wouldn't you be able to change their minds at will and take their lives? What's the difference between that and the original? Strictly speaking, compared to the original, wasn't it just an empty title? What's the difference?" Hearing this, the Divine Emperor's aura suddenly stagnated. "Even so," she murmured with a frown, an inexplicable look on her face. An existence like the Divine Emperor naturally had profound wisdom and understanding. How could she not hear that Luo Fan's words were more of an excuse for Gui Shou? It was just that, although it was an excuse, but she had to admit that what Luo Fan said was not unreasonable. Although these creatures didn't recognize her as their master now, that was only their subjective opinion. As a matter of fact, their essence was still in her hands. She could still control everything about them, including their lives, just like before. Under such circumstances, the situation was indeed no different from before. With this thought in mind, she still felt a little uncomfortable in her heart, a little unhappy. But at the very least, the intense anger from before had decreased by a lot. Even so, he still went too far. "Fellow Taoist, you must pay the price," the Divine Emperor said flatly. As she spoke, her aura, which seemed to have grown claws and teeth in the surrounding space-time and could tear everything apart at any time, gradually disappeared. She returned to her original appearance. "Price? What do you want, fellow Taoist?" Luo Fan asked with a sigh of relief. The Divine Emperor frowned at this. She had never thought about what she wanted. At this time, when Luo Fan suddenly asked, she couldn't say it for a while. Seeing her like this, Luo Fan knew what was going on and was about to speak. Suddenly, the divine emperor snorted and said, "Fellow Taoist, you've made me unhappy, so I'll make you unhappy too. If that's the case, let these civilized countries worship me and remove all information about you." Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed and said, "Since fellow Taoist has such a refined interest, then I will listen to fellow Taoist. You agree?" The divine emperor, who was about to listen to Luo Fan's bargaining, couldn't help but exclaim in disbelief when she heard this answer. As she spoke, her eyes were filled with shock and uncertainty. "Of course I agree. Although this will be a great loss to me, in order to appease you, I'll have to bite the bullet," Luo Fan said with a smile. At this time, the divine emperor's thoughts flashed like lightning, but he was thinking very carefully about what Luo Fan meant. With the power of the divine emperor, he was naturally able to tell at a glance that the living beings in these civilized countries were the new protagonists of the world. They might eventually grow to occupy the entire world, directly connecting the vast and boundless world into a vast and boundless civilized country, making all other living beings other than the living beings with born Taoism aptitudes to be the minority. In fact, even supreme rulers like them had no choice but to back down. If such a promising race could leave a deep mark in their race, if they could be worshipped and worshipped by the entire race, then the fate, energy and luck they would obtain would reach a level that she couldn't even imagine. By then, they might even break through the realm and become a true sage. Under normal circumstances, any emperors who obtained such a position would hold on to it tightly and never let go. How could they let it go just because of such a trivial matter? "What on earth do you mean? Can't you see it?" The more the divine emperor thought about it, the more he felt that something was wrong. He couldn't help but ask loudly. Even she didn't believe what he said. It should be noted that even an emperor like the Tsar could see this. Not to mention other emperors who were stronger and of a higher level than the Tsar. However, because the mark of Luo Fan had been deeply engraved in this civilized country, as long as Luo Fan didn't take the initiative to let go, no other emperors could replace him. Therefore, no other emperors tried to take action. It was also because this matter was almost equivalent to an opportunity for these emperors to achieve Taoism. If they directly snatched it, it would result in a fight to the death. Therefore, no emperors came to fight with Luo Fan for this position in a short period of time. Hearing the divine emperor's words, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "What other meaning do I have? It's just that I have my own path. I don't really care about such a position." In fact, Luo Fan had long seen that if he was worshipped by the whole civilized country, he would get a lot of fate, energy and luck when the whole world was completely unified by the civilized country in the future. However, he didn't care about all of this. For the other creatures in this world, they didn't know the key to becoming a true sage. They did not know the key to becoming a true sage, so they could only fumble around in the dark, trying to find the right path. They would try all kinds of paths. However, there was no need for him to do so. He clearly knew that if he wanted to become a sage, everything else was secondary. Only by perfecting his worldview and letting it grow to the point where it could support him to exist freely in the state of chaos was the real key. Under such circumstances, he naturally understood the blessing of fate energy. What blessing of luck energy? It was all for naught in the end. Under such circumstances, how could he have any thoughts about this position? Since others wanted it, so what if he gave it away? "Is what you said true?" the divine emperor asked incredulously. "Of course. If you don't believe me, why don't you change to another one?" Luo Fan said helplessly. Hearing this, the divine emperor shouted, "Who doesn't believe me? Since you should give it up, I dare to take it from you." As she spoke, her face was already a little red. Of course, this was not a red due to shyness or anger, but a red due to excitement. Although she was already an emperor of the highest level, the divine emperor still couldn't find a real path to become a true sage. Under such circumstances, she suddenly obtained a path that seemed to be very likely to let her become a true sage as long as she waited. How could she not be happy? How could she not be excited? That's good. I wonder when fellow Taoist plans to start? Luo Fan said indifferently. Of course, the sooner the better, the Divine Emperor said without any reservation at this time. At this time, the Divine Emperor didn't have the slightest bit of hostility towards Luo Fan. There was only kindness, as if she had seen a relative. If someone didn't know better, seeing the Divine Emperor like this, they might even suspect that she and Luo Fan had been old friends for billions of years, old cultivation companions. But you really won't regret it? This is the path to becoming a sage. Suddenly, the Divine Emperor frowned and looked at Luo Fan with some inexplicable confusion. Hearing this, Luo Fan said helplessly, "Everyone has their own path. I don't think my path is worse than this. Why should I change my path?" Hearing this, the Divine Emperor looked at Luo Fan with a strange expression. After a while, she finally gritted her teeth and said, "Do you really think your path is not worse than this one? To prevent us from turning against each other in the future, I think it's best for you to think carefully before you speak. In the past, I have walked on tens of thousands of paths. When I first cultivated, I felt that any one of them was not worse than any other path. In fact, it was even better than any other path. But in the end, I always found that it was not the right path. Perhaps the path you are walking on now is the same. Thank you for your concern, fellow Taoist. I've already made my decision, and I won't change it." Luo Fan shook her head and said helplessly, "Moreover, since fellow Taoist mentioned the path, how do you know that this path is not the same as the tens of thousands of paths you have walked before? It's just that fellow Taoist feels that it is better than any other path, but in the end it is not the right path." Chapter 1622. Naturally, Luo Fan just smiled. The God Emperor clearly felt that he had done all he could. He didn't stand on ceremony and swept his will across the entire civilized country in an instant. Then, an inexplicable thought appeared in the hearts of all the living beings in the civilized country. It was as if they should worship a supreme existence and offer their faith to that existence. Prompted by such a feeling, some people with keen senses quickly took action. The first statue of the God Emperor was carved in this world. Then, the first temple related to the God Emperor was built. As the statue was carved and the temple was built, the inexplicable thoughts in the hearts of many living beings were gradually alleviated. Under such circumstances, more and more temples were built, and more living beings began to worship the God Emperor's statue in these temples. After a few days, when temples of the God Emperor had been built everywhere in the civilized country, the inexplicable thoughts of many living beings gradually disappeared. The feeling that they had to offer their faith to that supreme existence also naturally faded. However, after the inexplicable thoughts faded, they didn't return to their original state. In fact, after this thought faded, the existence of the Divine Emperor seemed to have been engraved in the origin of their lives instinctively, making them feel a sense of dread. Unknowingly, they had taken the God Emperor's existence for granted. After that, the God Emperor didn't hesitate at all. He followed the connection between the civilized countries. As the will continued to warp, it passed through the layers of the void and crossed an unknown distance in spacetime. It kept moving between the many countries other than the Central Civilization Kingdom, constantly circulating, causing those countries to repeat the changes in the Central Civilization Kingdom. Just like that, in just a few short days, all the civilized countries in this part of the world would have billions of temples of godly emperors. Moreover, billions upon trillions of living beings had prostrated themselves before the Divine Emperor when the temples were completed. The God Emperor exhaled a long breath. An inexplicable sense of relief appeared on her face. She controlled the deep will of living beings. For an existence like her, this wasn't a difficult task. In other words, she had to make the living beings of a civilized country acknowledge her existence and build temples for her. This was not difficult for a divine emperor at all. However, this didn't mean that what she had done previously wasn't difficult. The truth was the exact opposite. What she had just done was unimaginably difficult. If she wasn't at the third level, which was the highest level of Emperor, she wouldn't have been able to do it. That was something that could allow one's will to travel across billions and trillions of light years, moving between billions and billions of civilizations. It was a method that directly treated the space and time of the world as nothing. That was the most troublesome method. Seeing her complete all these changes, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and his perceptions swept across the entire civilized country. He instantly sensed all the changes in this civilized country. Nodding his head slightly, he felt relieved. Although the Divine Emperor directly manipulated the will of the living beings, she did not go too far. Now, these living beings only acknowledged her existence in their hearts and regarded her as an extremely powerful expert, but they did not completely lose their faith in her. In other words, all living beings still had a future at this time. They could still continue to cultivate and grow, and would not lose their potential because of the Divine Emperor's methods. As long as this was done, the potential of this civilized country would not be damaged, and the true protagonist of this world would not be harmed. Don't worry, fellow Taoist, I know what I'm doing. The Divine Emperor watched as Luo Fan sensed the civilized country and smiled. At this time, her attitude toward Luo Fan had undergone a 180-degree change. It was no longer the anger she had shown before, and now she seemed extremely friendly. Luo Fan smiled. It's not that I don't trust you, fellow Taoist. I just wanted to confirm it. Are you sure it's done now? The Divine Emperor asked with a smile. Of course. Luo Fan smiled as well. The Divine Emperor smiled and suddenly changed the topic. However, for you to be able to comprehend these two divine lights, your fortuitous encounter is really enviable. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally smiled and said, It's indeed a good fortuitous encounter. It's just that it's too difficult to unify these two divine lights so that they don't clash. I'm even tied up here now and can't move at all. I don't know if I'm happy or worried. The Divine Emperor smiled. Of course, it's a great joy. Compared to one divine light, the future of two divine lights is more than 10 times brighter. In the future, when you reach my level, your strength will probably be more than 10 times stronger than mine. You're being modest, fellow Taoist. Perhaps you'll be stronger than me when I've mastered one divine light, but I'm afraid it's impossible for me to be stronger than you. Luo Fan only smiled. How is this being modest? When two conflicting divine lights are combined, their power will increase by hundreds or even thousands of times. Just like how you constructed the divine light into a magic treasure. You've only just comprehended it, but you've already easily disintegrated the means I've been comprehending for countless years, the Divine Emperor said nonchalantly. Seeing the Divine Emperor's reaction, Luo Fan knew that she was probably in a good mood. Thus, he seized the opportunity to ask, I've heard that there are 3 levels in the Emperor realm, but I only know that refining divine light is the first and second level. I don't know what's so special about the 3rd level. I hope fellow Taoist can teach me. Hearing this, the Divine Emperor chuckled and said, There's indeed such a division. It's just that this is a division made by bored people. In fact, for true emperors like me, what we pursue is to become a true sage. What's the point of this division? Hearing her say this, Luo Fan couldn't help but ponder. The Divine Emperor didn't let him think for too long. She quickly said, however, according to this division, the difference between a 3rd-level Emperor realm and a 2nd-level Emperor realm, it's actually very simple. Saying this, the Divine Emperor raised her hand and pointed. Instantly, a light that Luo Fan was very familiar with appeared on her hand. Within that light, there was an aura that all living beings yearned for. The inextinguishable aura. This is the inextinguishable divine light? Luo Fan's eyes narrowed and his mouth opened slightly. Yes, it's the inextinguishable divine light. the Divine Emperor praised. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart was in turmoil. He suddenly felt that his previous understanding of this world seemed to be completely wrong. The world in front of him seemed to contain a secret. The secrets contained in this world were probably more than what he had imagined. This time, it was already the second inextinguishable divine light that he had sensed in this world, although this inextinguishable divine light was not the real body, but an existence similar to a projection. But for it to exist, it must require the existence of an inextinguishable divine light. Back then, when he sensed an inextinguishable divine light in the cave residence of the World Emperor, it had almost subverted his understanding. However, the World Emperor was a living fossil who had lived since the era of the Heavenly Lord of Yuanshi. Compared to his experience, it was indeed not an inconceivable thing for him to possess an inextinguishable divine light. Luo Fan could still understand. But now, the World Emperor in front of him could actually display this inextinguishable divine light so easily. To be able to display this innate inextinguishable spirit light so easily, this clearly meant that there was more innate inextinguishable spirit light than he had imagined. Moreover, it was a lot more. This is the second inextinguishable divine light I've seen. Luo Fan sighed. Hearing Luo Fan sigh, the Divine Emperor couldn't help but be curious. He asked, "Fellow Taoist, have you seen the inextinguishable divine light?" "Yes, I've been to the World Emperor's cave residence and seen his inextinguishable divine light," Luo Fan said. "Oh, it's the World Emperor. It's not a secret that he has an inextinguishable divine light," the Divine Emperor said in realization. "I didn't expect to become a third-grade emperor. To need an inextinguishable divine light. It seems that I have no hope." Luo Fan sighed. "That's not necessarily true." "That's not necessarily the case," the Divine Emperor said with a strange expression. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean? Not necessarily? Could it be that there was an inextinguishable divine light without an owner? How was that possible? In this world, there were more than 30 publicly known emperors. Among them, only 1/3 of the emperors possessed the innate spirit light. There were still more than 20 emperors who didn't possess it. Moreover, he believed that there were less than 1/3 of the emperors in this world. Under such circumstances, if there was an inextinguishable divine light, how could those emperors let it go? How could they wait for Luo Fan to come and get it? The Divine Emperor smiled when he saw the change in Luo Fan's expression. "That's right. Fellow Taoist, you guessed correctly. There is a way to obtain an inextinguishable divine light in this world. Please enlighten me, fellow Taoist," Luo Fan said solemnly. The Divine Emperor smiled. "There's no need for that. It's not a secret. Almost all the emperors like me know about it. As long as you stay at this level for a long time, you'll naturally learn about it. In fact, there is a place in this world where inextinguishable divine light often appears. Right now, there is an inextinguishable divine light there that hasn't been tamed yet." "How can that be?" Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim. "How can there be an inextinguishable divine light? Moreover, there is an inextinguishable divine light that hasn't been tamed. Is the inextinguishable divine light really that powerful? That place doesn't give birth to the inextinguishable divine light. Instead, the inextinguishable divine light enters this world through that place. After all, the inextinguishable divine light is an existence close to a true saint. How can it be produced so easily? As for the inextinguishable divine light that hasn't been tamed, it's not because it's too powerful. It's because it hides so well that no one can detect it," the Divine Emperor said with a smile. "I can't believe there's such a place. Fellow Taoist, please enlighten me," Luo Fan said hurriedly. The Divine Emperor laughed and said, "Now that I've said this, I naturally have to tell you. Right then." Without hesitation, she pointed a finger. In an instant, a spiritual light condensed from information shot out. It pierced through the void, broke through the barrier of the spiritual light, and entered the two spiritual lights that Luo Fan had constructed. It came to stand in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan took the spiritual light. In an instant, the information contained in the spiritual light emerged in his mind. A look of realization appeared on his face. It appeared on his face in the blink of an eye. So it's this place. Thank you, fellow Taoist, Luo Fan said. The Divine Emperor smiled and said, since you already know about this, I won't disturb you any more. Farewell. While they were talking, she nodded slightly, turned around, and flew away. In the blink of an eye, she had completely disappeared in front of Luo Fan, returning to her cave abode. Although the current civilized country was still so insignificant compared to the whole world, not enough to bring much benefit to the Divine Emperor, she had, after all, deeply engraved her mark in the civilized country, sharing a bit of the destiny and luck of the civilized country. That feeling, compared to before, was already a little different. This required her to carefully sense it, and he had to control it well. Seeing that the Divine Emperor had left, Luo Fan did not hesitate. With a thought, a spiritual light clone condensed from the two kinds of spiritual light. Right now, his body was bound by the two spirit lights here. Before he could completely integrate the two spirit lights, he would not be able to escape. Once he moved, he would need to move with the two kinds of spiritual lights. This was obviously very inconvenient, and it would greatly affect his strength. Naturally, he could not move easily. Therefore, even if he wanted to explore the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, he could only let his spiritual light clone do it. Fortunately, although this spiritual light clone was only a clone, compared to the main body, it was only inferior in endurance. The strength and methods that it could truly display would not be much inferior to the main body. Letting him search for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light would not cause any losses due to his lack of strength. After the spiritual light clone condensed, it did not hesitate and directly rushed towards the place that the Divine Emperor had pointed out. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, if he really wanted to hurry along, any existence other than the primal chaos state would not be able to obstruct him. It was the same even for this extremely strange, high-end, and powerful world before his eyes. In the short span of a few dozen breaths, he had already traversed a distance of billions of light-years and arrived at a completely unfamiliar place. This location wasn't within the territory of any of the emperors. Instead, according to Luo Fan's understanding, it was an area that was billions of light-years away from the territories of the 30 emperors. In fact, there was no concept of heaven and earth here. It was just a blurry state. This scene was similar to the scene that the World Emperor's connate inextinguishable spiritual light had created, which simulated the chaotic state. Of course, it was only on the surface. In fact, strictly speaking, it was more like the scene that Luo Fan saw before the perspective of this world was completely changed, which was similar to the scene that Luo Fan saw when he was first sent to this world by the Jin Emperor. This is already close to the end of this world. Luo Fan looked at the blurry scene before him and constantly changed his perspective. In the end, he discovered that no matter how he changed his perspective, this place was still blurry and there was no change at all. Not to mention the fact that a vast, boundless, and incomparably high-end world was directly revealed like this heaven and earth. In the blur ahead, there was also a characteristic similar to the chaotic state. It seemed to encompass everything, as though everything existed in it. However, everything was chaotic and indistinguishable. What a strange love! Luo Fan sighed with emotion. Then, with a move of his heart, two kinds of spirit lights faintly constructed an invisible defense outside his body, firmly protecting him. Under the guidance of the God Emperor, there was a connate inextinguishable spiritual light at the center of the blurry existence. And that was also the point that connected the chaotic state. In the past countless years, there had been 6 connate inextinguishable spiritual lights that had drilled into this world from that point. Even The connate inextinguishable spiritual light that the God Emperor had mastered was one of them. The Chaos Well? Luo Fan thought to himself as he walked towards the blur. Sigh. Fellow Taoist, why are you doing this? Right at this moment, a leisurely voice rang in Luo Fan's ears. This voice was completely unfamiliar to Luo Fan. Based on his memory, he could clearly confirm that he had never heard this voice before. However, although he had never heard this voice before, it didn't mean that he didn't know the owner of this voice. In fact, he knew it the moment he heard it. It was a sovereign that might not be much weaker than the God Emperor. Luo Fan turned his head to look at the source of the voice and found that in the blur, a grayish silhouette appeared indistinctly. What is the meaning of this, fellow Taoist? Luo Fan asked faintly. I originally thought that fellow Taoist was just passing by, but now it seems that fellow Taoist is also here for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, right? The figure asked directly, ignoring Luo Fan's question. Hearing this, a trace of joy flashed in Luo Fan's eyes. Putting everything else aside, judging from the person's words, it was obvious that the connate inextinguishable spiritual light really did exist. I see. It seems that fellow Taoist is also here for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Although he was secretly delighted, Luo Fan said that out loud. At this moment, the grayish figure became clearer and clearer, more and more real. Not long later, it was completely revealed. It was a middle-aged man in a long robe. Looking at his appearance, he was also a true-born Taoism aptitude, and around his body there were many people. There were also wisps of spiritual light weaving together according to an extremely mysterious method, forming a defensive layer that looked like a vortex. It firmly blocked the surrounding blurry existence from eroding it. The man looked at Luo Fan with a hint of helplessness in his eyes that contained profound wisdom. He said, of course. If it wasn't for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, there's nothing in this place that's worthy of us coming here. However, there's only one connate inextinguishable spiritual light. I believe that fellow Taoist doesn't want anyone to compete for it, right? Luo Fan sighed inwardly when he heard this. When the man opened his mouth, he had already guessed the man's intentions. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light was an existence that could make one immortal and indestructible. Its preciousness was probably only inferior to the opportunity to become a true sage. Why would any living being who had the chance to obtain such a precious existence be willing to share it with anyone else? Even if the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was still hidden in the blurry darkness and could not be found, the person who arrived first would definitely not want others to compete with him. Not only the martial emperor, but even if Luo Fan had come here first, he would definitely be in the same situation. It seems that we still have to fight. Luo Fan sighed. Of course. Unless fellow Taoist is willing to give up, the king said plainly. My name is Luo Fan. How should I address you? Luo Fan looked at the king and suddenly smiled. When the king saw Luo Fan's smile, his heart skipped a beat. Then, he smiled back and said, You can call me the Broken Emperor. Judging from your name, you must have just become a king, right? I didn't expect fellow Taoist to be able to find this place right after becoming a king and compete for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Fellow Taoist's opportunity is really enviable. Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, So it's fellow Taoist Broken Emperor. Greetings, fellow Taoist. Indeed, many people say that I have a great opportunity and great luck. As he spoke, Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed at the air. His two spiritual lights slowly gathered between his hands, condensed, combined, and gradually formed a heaven-splitting axe. This was the first time he had used the strongest attack technique he had at the moment. The moment he condensed the spiritual light sky-splitting axe, he discovered that there was something special about this position. If he had condensed this spirit light heaven-splitting axe in any other place in this world, the world would have definitely been stimulated and would naturally condense a tribulation cloud, sending down a tribulation to destroy this spirit-light heaven-splitting act. Even if it wasn't in a civilized country, the tribulation wouldn't be as powerful as before, but it would still definitely appear. However, after he condensed the heaven-splitting axe here, he didn't feel the aura of a tribulation at all. Chapter 16:23. As soon as Luo Fan saw the scene in front of him, he knew that this area could no longer be regarded as a part of this world. And if this area was not regarded as a part of that unimaginably high-end world, then it could only be because of the influence of the chaotic state that came from the chaotic state of the entrance. However, at this time, Luo Fan did not have much time to waste on this. With a thought, the heaven-splitting axe was lifted up in an instant. With a slight shake, it directly chopped towards the broken emperor who appeared in front of Luo Fan. When the broken emperor saw the heaven-splitting axe coming, his face showed a dignified expression. With a thought, a strong spiritual light gushed out from his body, instantly condensing into a strange sphere in front of him. This sphere was extremely strange. It looked like a planet, but it also looked like a crystal ball. It also looked like a sun. After appearing in front of him, it began to rotate rapidly. The way it rotated seemed to contain some inconceivable principles, as if there were countless worlds and universes within it. After such a sphere appeared, the surrounding space within a range of billions of miles had undergone earth-shattering changes. The originally murky and chaotic scene split apart in the blink of an eye. Clear and turbid, the sun and the moon were formed. In the blink of an eye, there was an incomparably vast world. An infinitely vast world appeared in the surroundings, replacing the original gray. And at this moment, Luo Fan's heaven-splitting axe exuded a kind of power that could cut through everything. The moment it swept across, it directly split the world. A huge crack that seemed to have appeared in this world since its birth appeared. Such a crack directly started from the position of the heaven-splitting axe and went straight to the sphere that appeared in front of the broken emperor. A soft sound rang out. At this moment, a thin crack, or rather, a thin trace, appeared on the sphere. When it appeared on the sphere, it looked as though an invisible brush had brushed across the sphere. At this time, the broken emperor showed a sneer. He didn't seem to do anything, but the sphere abruptly split apart. In the blink of an eye, it transformed into billions of tiny parts, directly engraved in this world, transforming into the stars of this world. When this happened, the strength of the entire world suddenly increased by an unknown number of times. Originally, just the momentum of the heaven-splitting axe was enough to open such a huge crack in this world, but at this moment, after the strength of this world increased, not only was the heaven-splitting axe unable to open a crack in this world, it was also unable to do so. Moreover, even the huge crack that had just opened up in front of them was rapidly closing up at this moment. This appearance. It was as if this world had started to devour everything that didn't belong to this world after the appearance of this starry sky. At this moment, out of the countless trillions of stars, countless stars began to light up one by one in an instant. These stars were not to be recklessly used, but they were also very powerful. As each star lit up, it was as if the strength of this world had increased by another level. In this half a year, countless stars had lit up, and the strength of this world had risen to an indescribable level. In such a strong world, Luo Fan only had an inexplicable feeling, as if he had suddenly become an ordinary person. The suppression effect of the surrounding world on him had increased to the point that he couldn't even resist the gravity. At this time, his heaven-splitting axe seemed to have become an ordinary axe used to chop firewood. When he waved it, it couldn't even cut through the air. What a strong world! Luo Fan sighed with emotion in his heart at this moment. The strength of this world had already reached the limits of his imagination. Even the strength of Tianyuan Great World that he had seen before seemed to be far inferior to this world in front of him. Even a great world like Tianyuan Great World couldn't compare to it, let alone the great wilderness world or the Earth universe. Compared to this world, the gap between them was even more unimaginable. In such an inconceivable world, the broken emperor was like a god of creation. He floated in the starry sky. Countless starlight shone. He was like the master of the entire starry sky. It was as if the entire starry sky was revolving around him. At this moment, the broken emperor looked at Luo Fan, gently raised his hand, and pinched at the place where Luo Fan was. In an instant, an invisible arm suddenly appeared around Luo Fan's body, and began to pinch at Luo Fan's body. Facing such an invisible arm, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling. It was as if he wasn't facing an emperor, but a terrifying existence at the true divine level. This feeling of powerlessness, the strong premonition that all his resistance would be useless, made him suddenly have countless inexplicable thoughts. However, Luo Fan was, after all, Luo Fan. He wasn't the kind of person whose willpower couldn't be controlled. At this moment, under the urging of the strong willpower in his heart, this terrifying pressure was instantly broken, and his mind instantly returned to its original state. After returning to his normal state, Luo Fan didn't hesitate. He slightly turned the heaven-splitting axe in his hand, and in an instant, an axe light was directly waved by him. Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts had almost exhausted all the principles of the way of martial art. With such attainments in martial arts, even if it was an ordinary axe, with the strength of an ordinary person, it was enough to easily kill an immortal. Moreover, the axe in his hand was not an ordinary one, but a spiritual light heaven-splitting axe constructed by the condensation of two kinds of spiritual lights. It was a powerful existence that could even split the state of chaos, and could completely destroy everything in the world. Such an axe, even if it seemed to have become an ordinary axe at this time, as if it had become absolutely powerless against this world, it couldn't change its nature as a spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. When it was waved like this, however, its power had already increased by countless times. Under this axe, the world that was originally so strong that even his spiritual light heaven-splitting axe couldn't shake and couldn't be destroyed directly had billions of cracks appear. These cracks were deeply engraved in this world of spiritual light. They were directly produced from the time and space of this world. It was the countless stars that fixed this world and strengthened the strength of this world. At this time, there seemed to be corresponding changes, as if there were traces of cracks appearing on these stars. Martial arts were originally a means of exerting a certain amount of power that far exceeded the normal performance of a certain amount of power. Under such circumstances, the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe was activated by Luo Fan using martial art. The power that the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe could exert was naturally many times stronger than before. It couldn't be more normal for it to be able to split the world. After all, although the world was so powerful and so incredible, in terms of its origin, it was only constructed by the spiritual light of the broken emperor. Such a world, no matter how it behaved, compared to Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven-splitting axe, it was bound to have its limitations. At most, it was bound to be similar to the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. It had such an essence. Luo Fan could naturally think of some ways to let the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe get rid of the influence of this world. The large axe light that the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe released directly blasted towards the invisible hand that was squeezing down on Luo Fan. In the blink of an eye, endless brilliance erupted from the point where the axe light and the invisible hand came into contact. Under that intense light, the entire world shook violently. In this shaking, the endless stars in the starry sky seemed to be constantly shaken by a big hand. Every star began to shake violently in an instant. If there were only one or two of these stars shaking, it naturally wouldn't be conspicuous. If one's perception wasn't sharp, it would be extremely easy to ignore it. But now, the number of stars swaying in this way was endless. Almost all the stars in the entire starry sky were shaking at the same time. This scene couldn't even be described with the word big. At this moment, the entire starry sky was like a dice thrown into a bowl, shaking crazily. The broken emperor shouted softly at this time, raised his hand and gently pointed at the starry sky. In an instant, the violently shaking starry sky slightly stabilized. In the blink of an eye, it was as if nothing had happened, completely stabilized. However, although the starry sky had stabilized, the invisible hand that was squeezing down on Luo Fan had completely collapsed at this time. Around Luo Fan's body, the countless axe lights had formed a vast and boundless world, directly blocking all the rules of this world, all the space-time, and all the power outside this world of axe light. In this world of axe lights, all the suppression that the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe received had completely disappeared. Above the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe, it was still exuding a kind of earth-splitting charm. And Luo Fan, who was holding this spiritual light heaven-splitting axe, looked more like Pangu, who was in a state of chaos, ready to split the heavens and the earth at any time. Facing all these changes, the broken emperor didn't show any expression of disbelief. At this moment, he did not hesitate to turn his hand in the void, and then slapped towards Luo Fan. Following that, the endless stars trembled slightly, and starlight condensed. In the blink of an eye, it had already formed a fist outside of Luo Fan's world of axe lights, directly blasting towards the world of axe lights. Facing such a bombardment, Luo Fan smiled faintly. The spiritual light heaven-splitting axe in his hand shook slightly, and instantly slashed towards the fist. This was an axe that could split the heavens and the earth. In this axe, one could even understand all the martial arts principles related to the axe. As the axe slashed out, the world of axe light began to churn violently. As it churned, it began to expand rapidly, directly blocking the starlight fist that was coming towards him. Asterisk kaboom asterisk an earth-shattering thunderclap sounded in an instant. The starlight fist collided with his world of axe light. In an instant, the world of axe lights shattered, and a huge hole appeared, a hole that was big enough for the starlight fist to pass through. However, the starlight fist did not reach this step without any cost. In fact, in order to achieve this step, the starlight fist was already covered with countless cracks. These cracks appeared on the surface of the starlight fist and spread straight to the depths of the starlight fist. One could even faintly see the scene behind the starlight fist through these cracks. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven-splitting axe finally came into contact with the fist. With a soft sound, the starlight fist did not have the slightest ability to resist. It had already been split open by the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe from head to tail. Moreover, at the place where the starlight fist was split open. In other words, above the crack, there were countless worlds and worlds being born within it. These worlds, they were like grapes, densely piled up in this crack. Faintly, one could even see countless creatures being born and growing at an unimaginable speed in these worlds, and finally reaching an incredible height. As the crack expanded, these worlds began to increase, constantly devouring the surrounding spacetime, gradually turning the surrounding spacetime into these worlds. Of course, compared to the speed of birth in the starlight fist before. After these worlds broke through the range of the starlight fist, the speed of their birth began to rapidly slow down. At this moment, the broken emperor finally frowned. He saw his hands tremble slightly at this moment. As his hands trembled, the endless stars in the starry sky began to move continuously. The distribution of these stars had actually already surpassed the level that could be described by arrays, and could only be described by the Great Path. Right now, this kind of movement seemed to be directly manipulating the Great Tao, causing the mysteries contained in these stars to become completely different from before, even though it was not an increase. Although it was not an increase, it had an absolute counter to the countless growing and spreading worlds in front of him. All kinds of invisible laws were naturally born. It began to form more and more intense pressure on the countless worlds, causing the speed of their birth to gradually slow down. However, Luo Fan's reaction was also very powerful. At this moment, his spiritual light heaven-splitting axe kept swinging, and axe lights that seemed to be able to split the heavens and earth were sent out by him, continuously striking the worlds outside the axe light world. He created one world group after another, constantly resisting the broken emperor's means, causing the expansion of the world group to barely maintain the same speed. The two's means were roughly equal. When the world group finally could not increase anymore, when the situation completely stabilized, the entire world group was almost evenly divided. One of them was the starry sky world in the hands of the broken emperor. The other was the countless worlds in the hands of Luo Fan. Among the countless worlds, Luo Fan stood in the middle. Around him, the axe light world surged slightly, and an inexplicable connection connected the countless worlds in the world group. The power of each other was connected, causing the countless worlds in the world group to be completely connected at this time, forming an extremely complete and extremely tight whole. Although it was only a few dozen breaths, due to the different flow of time, at this time, every world in the world group had already grown to an incredible level. It was unknown how many false sages were born among them, constantly traveling between the countless worlds, causing those worlds to become more and more stable and powerful as time passed. This kind of stability and power was naturally not meaningless. In fact, this kind of stability and power was precisely the way to resist the powerful starry sky world that the broken emperor had built. Good means. I didn't expect my broken world to be blocked by Taoist friends' simple destructive means, the broken emperor said at this time. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, Taoist friend, you have misunderstood. My heaven-splitting axe doesn't only have destructive power. The most powerful thing about the heaven-splitting axe is creation. Hearing this, the broken emperor smiled faintly and said, Creation? In that case, let me see how strong the creation ability of Taoist friends means is. As they spoke, in the starry sky world, the stars began to leave their original positions like meteors. One by one, they collided with the world group around Luo Fan. Boom, 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 boom. Every collision of a star would create countless terrifying vibrations out of thin air, even forming an unknown number of sound waves in the world group. As for the world group around Luo Fan, the moment every star collided with it, it was like a drop of boiling oil was dripped into a drop of water, causing violent riot. It was unknown how many worlds were directly destroyed in this process. All of them turned into countless fragments and splattered everywhere. Such a continuous collision of stars caused the originally extremely close relationship between the world group to become a noose around the neck of the entire world group. This caused the world group to rapidly advance in the direction of destruction. Facing this process, Luo Fan's heart stirred, and he did not hesitate to wave the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe in his hand. Streaks of axe light shot out from the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe and directly poured into the world group. Worlds that were like bunches of grapes began to be born continuously, perfectly filling the gap caused by the collision of the stars. This entire process of destruction and creation was simply like two brothers of the same sect that understood each other extremely well and cooperated extremely well with each other, were practicing their means. Seeing all this, the broken emperor frowned even more. With a light shout, the stars that filled the sky no longer charged towards the world group one by one, but started to charge towards the world group in large groups. If the previous collision of stars was said to be like ordinary meteors, then, at this time, the impact of a large group of stars was already like a meteor storm. This sudden and intense impact naturally made Luo Fan feel even stronger pressure. He had no choice but to increase the speed of the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. He had no choice but to make up for the loss of that world as soon as possible. These world groups were the defensive layer that Luo Fan used to escape from the control of the starry sky world. As long as these worlds existed, The broken emperor could not use the power of the starry sky world to easily deal with Luo Fan. However, if these world groups were completely destroyed, if Luo Fan wanted to fight against the starry sky world again, he would need to use more and more powerful means to be able to do it. It was precisely because of the importance of these world groups. Luo Fan had no choice but to do his best to maintain their existence. Of course, it was also because of this that the Broken Emperor regarded this world group as the target of attack. It seems that it's still not enough, the Broken Emperor suddenly said. With this sentence, he suddenly raised his hand and clapped forward. In an instant, another sphere like the starry sky world appeared out of thin air in front of him. After the appearance of this sphere, the surrounding starry sky world seemed to have been further strengthened. Vaguely, its strength seemed to have increased by several times. Then, with a slight tremble, the sphere split into billions of fragments. These fragments did not evolve into stars. Instead, after appearing, they began to converge into a long river, directly rushing towards the world group around Luo Fan's body. At this moment, Luo Fan felt a strong sense of crisis. He glanced around and instantly saw the long river rushing towards him like the Milky Way. He instantly knew what was going on. Driven by the sense of crisis in his heart, he opened his mouth and let out a loud roar. Then, the spiritual light in his body poured into the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe in his hand without hesitation. With the infusion of spiritual light, the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe began to expand crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had grown from the original size of an ordinary axe to the size of 10 times its original size. Of course, although it had become 10 times bigger, it still did not feel awkward in Luo Fan's hand. It did not feel the slightest bit out of place. It still felt as natural as the size of a normal axe. After all, Luo Fan could almost be said to be the supreme emperor. After the body emitted these 2 rays of spiritual light, the body of Luo Fan's spiritual light clone became a little blurry again. Obviously, for him, drawing out the spiritual light again was obviously an action that brought great pressure to him. Similarly, if one carefully observed the Broken Emperor, one would find that after emitting another spiritual light sphere, his body seemed to have become a little blurry. Moreover, if one were to accurately distinguish, one could even see that the extent of his body's blur was even greater than that of Luo Fan's spiritual light clone. With one look, one would know that the price he paid was greater than that of Luo Fan. Chapter 1624. The huge spiritual light heaven-splitting axe instantly split apart the world of the axe light, as well as the countless other worlds in the world of the axe light. It was true that the heaven-splitting axe could create countless worlds and worlds. However, before it could create a new world, it had to first break the original chaos. Therefore, it was obvious that the sky-splitting axe was not only used to create worlds. Its destructive means were much more powerful than anyone had imagined. The spiritual light heaven-splitting axe instantly collided with the spherical spiritual light fragment river that the Broken Emperor had blasted out. In an instant, endless cracks appeared in the starry sky world. These cracks started from the point where the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe and the long river collided. In the blink of an eye, they had already covered the entire world. In the blink of an eye, the entire world seemed to have become a combination of countless tiny fragments. It felt as if it was going to completely collapse in the next moment and turn into countless fragments that scattered in all directions. At the same time, the countless worlds that Luo Fan had created with the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe also began to collapse one by one. Compared to the starry sky realm, these world clusters were different. That was, there were countless living beings and cultivators in these worlds. Among these countless living beings and cultivators, there were even false sages that had been born. They connected these worlds together and formed an extremely complete whole. Under such circumstances, the sudden collapse of these worlds instantly aroused a strong reaction from the countless living beings. For a moment, countless screams and cries came from those worlds. Along with these screams, endless resentment surged out from the cries. These resentment were so strong that they had even turned into endless ghosts and gods that began to pounce towards the two sides of the battle, which was Luo Fan and the Broken Emperor. Under normal circumstances, these ghosts and gods, even a false sage would probably not be able to withstand them. They would be directly pulled into the depths of hell by these ghosts and gods and would never be able to rise again. However, at this moment, these ghosts and gods formed by resentment were not facing ordinary false sages. They were facing Luo Fan. It was the Broken Emperor. Existences at their level were already almost indestructible. This kind of resentment that was lethal to false saints was naturally like a light breeze to them. However, it didn't provoke any reaction from them at all, let alone make them feel any discomfort. However, in the face of so many grievances, Luo Fan sighed in the end. After all, he was the one who created these worlds. These creatures were naturally created by him. Under such circumstances, it was still very uncomfortable for these creatures to harbor such strong resentment toward him. His cultivation had reached such a level, and his Tao heart had reached such a firm state. However, it didn't mean that he had a heart of stone and was emotionless. As a matter of fact, to existences like Luo Fan and the others, Luo Fan was not a match for them. If they wanted to experience any sort of emotion, it would be thousands of times more intense than normal. The emotions that these emotions brought them were also countless times more intense than ordinary living beings. Therefore, it was normal for Luo Fan to feel this kind of sadness in his heart. Fellow Taoist, you've done all of this before. What was the point? Even if you created them, wouldn't they still hate you in the end? The Broken Emperor suddenly said. When Luo Fan heard this, he couldn't help but be slightly stunned. One had to know that the Broken Emperor had no reason to say such words at this time. After all, this kind of thing was meaningless to the Broken Emperor. To the Broken Emperor, the most important thing now was the battle with Luo Fan. It should be the result of the battle between the spiritual light sphere fragment river and Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven splitting axe. However, the Broken Emperor, who had no reason to say such words now, actually said such words. No matter how one looked at it, it was unbelievable. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan glanced at the World Emperor. In an instant, he discovered that the World Emperor's gaze seemed to be a little distant at this moment, as if there was an inexplicable memory in his mind. Seeing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood. Perhaps the Broken Emperor had encountered what he was going through at this moment a very long time ago. He was resented and even betrayed by the creatures he created. Now that he saw something similar, he sighed with emotion and said at this time. Understanding this, he smiled faintly and said, "They have the right to resent me. Although I created them, once they are created, they already possess a complete life and have their own independent selves. This kind of complete life and independent consciousness naturally have their own wisdom, their own thoughts, and their survival instincts have already appeared. In this way, they will naturally be afraid of destruction and will naturally resent death. Is there anything abnormal about this? I didn't expect Taoist friend to be so open-minded. I'm not as good as you." The Broken Emperor sighed. As he said this, he raised his hand and turned it slightly. In an instant, the spiritual light heaven splitting axe that was colliding with Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven splitting axe began to undergo a huge change. In the blink of an eye, all the fragments in the spiritual light heaven splitting axe condensed and formed a figure. At first glance, this figure looked like the Broken Emperor. However, it was tens of thousands of times bigger than the Broken Emperor. After it appeared, it was like a supreme god that could support the heavens and the earth. It raised its head and let out a shocking roar. As it roared, it suddenly raised its fist and fiercely punched at Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven splitting axe. Previously, Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven splitting axe had chopped at the spiritual light heaven splitting axe, but it was blocked by the terrifying power in the spiritual light heaven splitting axe, which was why it couldn't completely cut the spiritual light heaven splitting axe. Under such circumstances, the spiritual light heaven splitting axe suddenly collapsed and reformed. The power that blocked the spiritual light heaven splitting axe naturally disappeared. In an instant, the spiritual light heaven splitting axe advanced for an unknown amount of distance. However, just as the spiritual light heaven splitting axe was about to chop down, the figure that appeared at this moment was almost the same as the broken emperor. In just an instant, the figure that was tens of thousands of times bigger than the broken emperor's fist had already arrived in front of Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven splitting axe. During the whole process, not only did time and space distort, but it also seemed like the entire world had been twisted. Time reversal? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he didn't hesitate to shake the spiritual light heaven splitting axe. With a loud cracking sound, the spiritual light heaven splitting axe seemed to have directly opened up a new world. Then, inside the spiritual light heaven splitting axe, a new world was born. This world was completely different from the outside world. It was different from the starry sky world and the countless worlds in the surrounding world cluster. This world was the world of spiritual light. It was completely formed by the two kinds of spiritual lights that Luo Fan had mastered, decomposing and reforming them in a very special and mysterious way. Such a world of spiritual light was the beginning of summer. Not only did it not weaken the power of the spiritual light heaven splitting axe, but it also instantly turned into a source of power for the spiritual light heaven splitting axe. In an instant, the strength of the spiritual light heaven splitting axe soared several times. Moreover, the speed of the spiritual light heaven splitting axe also soared several times. With this change, the spiritual light heaven splitting axe seemed to have cut through something and directly hit the body of the broken emperor, which was tens of thousands of times bigger than the original position. Puff, with a soft sound, the body of the broken emperor, which was tens of thousands of times bigger, instantly collapsed. The countless tiny fragments made his entire body look like it was made up of tiny grains of sand. As the countless fragments flew in all directions, a pitch-black existence vaguely appeared in the midst of the countless fragments. This pitch-black existence seemed to have endless mass. It had an incredible repulsive force, and after it appeared, it began to expel everything around it in a frenzy. The speed at which the fragments splashed around became faster and faster. Seeing this, a strong sense of crisis instantly surged in Luo Fan's heart. It was as if that pitch-black existence was the eye of an existence that was a natural enemy to him. What is this? At this moment, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he didn't hesitate to turn the spiritual light heaven splitting axe in his hand. In an instant, the spiritual light heaven splitting axe drew a trajectory that could split the heavens and earth. In an instant, when it was impossible, it directly struck the pitch-black object. Before the spiritual light heaven splitting axe hit the dark thing. The closer the spiritual light heaven splitting axe got to the dark thing, the stronger the terrifying repulsive force produced by the dark thing. In the end, it even made Luo Fan feel as if he had used all of his strength and all of his means to make the spiritual light heaven splitting axe really come into contact with the dark thing. However, the moment the spiritual light heaven splitting axe hit the dark thing, the originally extremely powerful and terrifying repulsive force that even a king would find difficult to deal with suddenly turned into an attractive force that was several times stronger than the repulsive force. The entire transformation process was so sudden that Luo Fan couldn't react. He even felt as if this repulsive force itself was an attractive force, and the feeling of repulsive force before was just an illusion. Such a hasty change was simply fatal for Luo Fan. At this moment, he didn't have any ability to resist at all. He found that about 1/3 of his spiritual light heaven-splitting axe had been devoured. This kind of devouring was not simply tearing apart a part of it, but completely devouring the essence of the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. What a strange existence! Luo Fan was secretly horrified. At this moment, he decisively cut off the part of the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe that came into contact with the dark thing. In the end, with great difficulty, he managed to retain the remaining 2/3 of the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. From the looks of it, at this moment, Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven-splitting axe had become broken. A huge bite mark had appeared, which had eliminated most of the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. It looked as if it had been bitten by something. At this time, because of the previous terrifying impact, whether it was the starry sky world created by the Broken Emperor or the world cluster created by Luo Fan, they had completely collapsed. At this moment, around Luo Fan and the Broken Emperor, there was no longer any trace of that world. There were no longer any traces of that world, and the whole place seemed to have completely returned to its original appearance when Luo Fan first arrived. In other words, it was a completely gray and hazy area. As for the broken fragments of the starry sky world and the world cluster, at this time, they had been completely swallowed by the surrounding gray and could no longer be found. That dark existence, after devouring a part of Luo Fan's spiritual light heaven-splitting axe, had also changed. At this moment, originally, it had no size and seemed to be just an insignificant. The existence of the singularity, which could not be detected, had already begun to slowly grow. Gradually, it grew from a small dot to an extremely strange shape. This is something I obtained by chance in the process of looking for the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Please have a look. At this time, the Broken Emperor's smiling voice came into Luo Fan's ears. Hearing this, Luo Fan sucked in a breath of cold air. An object from the state of chaos? In an instant, the way he looked at this dark existence had become completely different. What could exist completely in the state of chaos? It was either the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, the existence of the true divine realm, or the perfect heaven and earth. Any one of them, for Luo Fan at this time, was a completely irresistible existence. This black existence in front of him was actually at the same level as all the other irresistible existences. This made him involuntarily become solemn. However, soon, Luo Fan had already discovered that something was wrong. That was the Broken Emperor's body. But there was already a change. At this moment, the Broken Emperor's body was like a pool of clear water that had been poured into a vat of ink. A black color directly appeared on his chest, and from there, it began to spread up and down his body. In the blink of an eye, it had already spread to his whole body, making his whole body look a bit turbid at this time. In addition to the changes in his body, the Broken Emperor's complexion also changed a little. Previously, when he said that he wanted to have a fight with Luo Fan, he was still calm and rational. It seemed that he had reached this conclusion after careful consideration. There was no negative emotion mixed in it. But at this moment, his face seemed to carry a kind of brutality, which made his current behavior not seem like a decision made after careful consideration and weighing the pros and cons. Instead, it seemed like he was venting his anger. This is, his mind has been affected. Could it be because of this black existence? Luo Fan thought inwardly. At this time, the black existence in front of him had already grown to the size of a person. It was not in the shape of a human, but in a strange form. It had a pair of wings that were like the blade of an axe, and they were uneven wings like the blade of an axe, and its whole body looked extremely strange, as if it was constantly changing into various strange forms, as if it had no fixed form at all. What is this? At this time, Luo Fan had no choice but to cast his eyes on the body of this pitch-black thing in front of him. After this pitch-black thing changed into this form, its body began to emit a strange aura. This strange aura was extremely strange. It seemed to be incomparably strong but also incomparably weak. Its strength was even enough to make Luo Fan feel afraid, and vaguely threaten Luo Fan's life. However, it was as weak as the weakest of ants. At this moment, apart from the constant changes of its body, there was no movement, and it quietly floated there. Luo Fan's rich knowledge had reached an unimaginable level. Very soon, he had already discovered some kind of indescribable existence around the pitch-black thing. Time, beside the pitch-black thing, the essence of time, which was originally somewhat illusory in Luo Fan's eyes, actually gave birth to some kind of change that even Luo Fan could not control. This change was similar to the change of time that was completely independent of the body of a sage. It was as if it had suddenly broken away from the illusory state and had become a real substance, something that could even be controlled and changed by any ordinary person. Yes, it's the characteristics of a true sage. After discovering this, Luo Fan could not help but feel an indescribable sense of crisis. This kind of change of time was clearly a characteristic that only a true sage could have. The essence of a true sage was already completely independent of all time and space. It was independent of the chaotic state. Such an existence, wherever it was, time, space, matter, energy, and even everything else would naturally be independent. It was natural that they would have independence. In other words, no matter where a true divine stood, the flow of time, the changes in the flow of time, the distortion and rupture of space, the continuation of the state, and even the weight of matter, and other characteristics of the real and false could be sensed. The density of energy, the modeled, the texture, and so on and so forth. Everything would be completely isolated from the outside world. It would have the characteristics that were completely suitable for a true sage. It would become incomprehensible to all existences in the outside world. Obviously, at this moment, the time around the pitch-black thing. It had such a characteristic. Of course, only time could have such a special characteristic. As for space, matter, energy, and other aspects, it was still almost the same as normal. It seems that in terms of time, it has the characteristics of a true sage, Luo Fan thought. At that moment, the black creature with the axe-like wings suddenly moved. In an instant, it shook slightly, and its body quickly pounced towards Luo Fan. A sharp pain instantly came from Luo Fan's chest. The moment after this sharp pain came, the pitch-black thing arrived in front of Luo Fan. It was also at this moment that Luo Fan discovered the sharp pain in his chest. It was the wings of this pitch-black thing. The wings that were like the heaven-splitting axe. Time reversal. Luo Fan understood in his heart. Immediately afterward, a soft bang sounded out, and his entire body shattered, turning into countless tiny spiritual light fragments that splattered in all directions. The entire spiritual light doppelganger had been directly torn apart by the original existence that had the characteristics of a true sage. At this moment, Luo Fan already knew what it felt like to be hit by his spiritual light splitting axe, although it had been completely smashed to pieces. But this did not mean that Luo Fan had lost his spiritual light doppelganger. In fact, let alone a spiritual light doppelganger. Even if Luo Fan's original body was split into countless pieces, even if all of his existence was erased, it did not mean that he was dead. Now, although it had turned into spiritual light fragments, Luo Fan's spiritual light doppelganger still existed. He was still sensing the surroundings in the form of spiritual light fragments. However, at this moment, the power of the heaven-splitting axe was entangled with each of his spiritual light fragments. It naturally opened up one world after another around the spiritual light fragments, trying its best to integrate the spiritual light fragments into the operation of the world. It wanted to completely digest the spiritual light fragments and erase all traces of the spiritual light fragments. These worlds were opened up by the heaven-splitting axe. Although countless worlds were born at the same time, Each world was actually at the same level as the world that could give birth to a false sage, who became a sage with the mysterious mysteries of a true sage. The rules and laws were strict, and the strength of the great Tao had reached an unimaginable level. After being swallowed by such a world, every bit of Luo Fan's spiritual light fragments naturally received a strong impact. In a trance, it was as if every bit of spiritual light fragment had turned into a living creature and was thrown into the reincarnation of those worlds. As the reincarnation rotated again and again, he died again and again and again. He cultivated again and again. In the process of reincarnation, all traces of him were erased, and these spiritual light fragments were completely turned into ownerless spiritual light fragments. Fortunately, Luo Fan's cultivation willpower was strong to an unimaginable level. Even though his body had been shattered into countless spiritual light fragments, he did not have the intention to change his cultivation. Even if every bit of spiritual light fragment was swallowed into those worlds, even if it was sent into reincarnation after reincarnation, it could still return again and again through cultivation, retrieving the memories that had been erased by those worlds and finally restoring its original nature. Just like that, after countless years in those worlds, when those worlds were completely destroyed, all of Luo Fan's spiritual light fragments finally reappeared intact. Moreover, as it began to condense rapidly, in the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into a new Luo Fan in a gray haze. At this moment, only a few breaths had passed since Luo Fan's spiritual light clone had been shattered. It's even stronger than the heaven-splitting axe that I control, as expected of an existence with some kind of true sage trait. Feeling the difference in time between the worlds, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart. Chapter 1625. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. With a sweep of his eyes, he discovered an unbelievable fact. That was, at this moment, the pitch-black, unpredictable existence with axe-like wings had already inserted its wings into the broken Emperor's body. And the broken Emperor's entire body, at this moment, was already covered with countless cracks. However, there was not much pain on his face, only a kind of increasingly unconcealable brutality. Then, there was an earth-shattering explosion. The broken Emperor's entire body had been completely blown up. It looked as if his entire body had suddenly turned into a cloud of smoke. The whole process was so strange, so incredible that Luo Fan couldn't react for a while. As an existence that had been broken by the heaven-splitting axe, it was obvious what would happen when the broken Emperor exploded into pieces. In an instant, it was unknown how many worlds were formed out of thin air, directly swallowing every tiny, powder-like fragment. Compared to Luo Fan, who could detach from those worlds in the state of fragments and restore his body, the broken Emperor's entire body began to gradually disappear after such a change. After all, there was not much difference between the broken Emperor's level and Luo Fan's. But before this, the broken Emperor was not in a normal state. It was unknown what had affected his mind, but it was in a tyrannical and self-destructive state. In such a state, how much of his will could the fragments of his body maintain? After this kind of preserved will entered the reincarnation of those worlds, the first decision it made was inevitably to destroy. That was to fight against heaven and earth. In this way, how could it be possible to detach? How could it be possible to return? Therefore, in just a short moment, even less than a breath, the large cloud of smoke that the broken Emperor had turned into had completely disappeared. Along with the disappearance of the smoke, it was unknown how many billions of worlds had been created by the heaven-splitting axe. How many billions of worlds? Is this the legendary harming others and oneself, or is this the broken Emperor's own scheme? At this time, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, before Luo Fan could figure it out, the pitch-black existence that had entered this world from the chaotic state had already turned around and faced Luo Fan again. This is troublesome. In an instant, Luo Fan could only shift his thoughts from the original broken emperor to this pitch-black existence in front of him. This pitch-black existence had the time characteristic of a true sage. This characteristic was extremely difficult for Luo Fan to deal with. At this moment, he could not think of any way to deal with him. At this moment, a strong sense of danger welled up in his heart. In an instant, Luo Fan recalled the entire process of his body being shattered. He instinctively turned the spirit light heaven-splitting axe in his hand and smashed it in front of him. Crack a deafening thunderclap rang out. In an instant, countless sound waves erupted amidst the thunderous roars, completely drowning out the surrounding gray haze. As a result, the surrounding gray fog completely lost its original form. At this time, Luo Fan still hadn't discovered what it was that had come here. However, that strong sense of crisis still existed. Furthermore, he felt a strong sense of danger. It was even more intense than before. Following this sense of danger, Luo Fan instinctively turned the spirit light heaven-splitting axe and smashed it behind him. Crack. Similarly, a deafening thunderclap rang out. Similarly, endless sound waves were born and began to collapse in all directions, constantly colliding with the sound waves that were born from the sound wave. They were constantly tangled and fighting. They either merged with each other and eventually became stronger, or they annihilated each other and disappeared together. Almost in the blink of an eye, it was unknown how many worlds were born and destroyed in the surroundings. At this time, Luo Fan already knew what was going on. This was clearly the pitch-black existence that came from the chaotic state using some kind of method to reverse the flow of time to fight with him. At this moment, Luo Fan's spirit light heaven-splitting axe hit the wings of the pitch-black existence. However, it was not the wings of the present or the wings of the past, but the wings of the future. In other words, the pitch-black existence was using a method to reverse the flow of time to attack him from the future. Just as I said before, the past is certain, and there is only one of it. However, there were countless possibilities in the future. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan encountered this kind of attack at the same time. Moreover, every time he blocked the opponent's attack, it would inevitably cause the opponent's attack to slow down. However, at the same time, the attack did not stop at all and continued to attack him from another direction. Knowing this situation, Luo Fan suddenly had a flash of inspiration. In an instant, the flow of time around his body began to change rapidly. Of course, although the flow of time was changing, it was not as fast as that of a true sage, nor was it as fast as the pitch-black existence that had the characteristics of a true sage. It was just constantly accelerating, decelerating, and accelerating compared to a true sage. This method was only lacking in the reverse flow of time. In the midst of such changes, Luo Fan faintly felt that there were countless pitch-black beings with axe-like wings piled up around his body. They were aiming at different angles, and using completely different speeds, they fiercely stabbed at him. This was the truth of the attack that he had blocked previously. There are actually so many of them. This is almost using the reverse flow of time to its limit. Luo Fan was shocked at this moment. Just one of the existences that possessed the characteristics of a true divine was enough to make Luo Fan feel difficult to deal with, and it was enough to pose a huge threat to him. Now, so many of them had actually appeared at the same time. For him, the threat and pressure had already reached a level that was enough to make him feel fear. Fortunately, he had now comprehended the effect of the use of time. Using different time dimensions to divide the surroundings, this allowed the countless attacks from different futures to truly appear. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would still be exhausted from running for his life. He could only constantly block the attacks that approached his body and couldn't fully consider these attacks. With a thought, endless spiritual light burst out from Luo Fan's body. These spiritual lights condensed into countless heaven-splitting axes in the void. As the countless spiritual lights burst out, the body of Luo Fan's heaven-splitting axes began to quickly become blurry and began to rapidly transform in the direction of destruction. Although the countless heaven-splitting axes he condensed at this time were many times smaller than the heaven-splitting axes Luo Fan condensed before, the one he was holding now was still the same size as the ordinary heaven-splitting axes. However, this number had already reached an unimaginable level, so the pressure on Luo Fan was naturally much greater than that of a single heaven-splitting axe. After all, this number had reached an unimaginable level. The pressure on Luo Fan as a whole was naturally much greater than that of a single heaven-splitting axe. It could be said that at this moment, Luo Fan's heaven-splitting axe didn't completely collapse. This was because at this moment, there were countless strange and unpredictable time dimensions protecting his body. This wasn't difficult to understand. Because there were so many time dimensions around him, the time dimension where his body was located naturally became extremely unusual. The result of this abnormality was that the speed of his body's collapse also became unusual. In other words, the process of collapse that could have been completed in an instant could be stretched to countless years at this time. Or, the collapse that could have been completed in countless years could be shortened to an instant. That was why this happened. Normally, his body would have completely collapsed and been destroyed in an instant, but it seemed that he could still hold on with his body on the verge of destruction and collapse as the price. The countless heaven-splitting axes condensed by Luo Fan circled around mysterious trajectories after they appeared. With a momentum that could split the heavens and split the earth apart, he headed straight for the pitch-black existences that had traversed through time and space to attack him from an unknown number of futures. Although those pitch-black existences were powerful, however, the attack method that it was using was still similar to the spiritual light heaven-splitting axe. If such an attack was used against anyone else, even if it was a god emperor or a world emperor, they would inevitably be battered and exhausted. They might not even be able to find an effective method to deal with it. However, such an attack was nothing to Luo Fan. It must be known that he was the one who condensed the heaven-splitting axes. Now, they were using such an attack method that he created to attack him? This was simply as ridiculous as using a flood to deal with the ocean. However, Luo Fan had countless ways to deal with the flaws of that attack. In other words, he had countless ways to deal with the pitch-black existence's attack at this moment. At this moment, the countless tiny sky-splitting axes had easily and freely struck the pitch-black existences in profound trajectories. Although the pitch-black existence used all its means to resist the spirit-light heaven-splitting axes, although it flapped its wings even harder, faster, and pushed the attack to a more terrifying level, it still couldn't resist. However, in the end, it still couldn't stop the attack. He could only watch helplessly as the heaven-splitting axe chopped down on the pitch-black existence, causing the pitch-black existence to gradually collapse. Not long after, all of the pitch-black existences had turned into nothingness. Even their wings had disappeared from this world, as if they had never appeared in the first place. After doing all this, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. Looking through the strange and incomparably complicated time dimension, he instantly discovered that the pitch-black existences were still hovering there as if they hadn't moved at all. What he saw in the strange time dimension just now was that the countless pitch-black existences were completely shattered and all traces of existence were completely erased like an illusion. Seeing this, Luo Fan's heart moved. He instantly understood what was going on and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Sure enough, there are countless futures. In this way, it's almost impossible to die. Thinking of this, his mind was a bit numb. There were countless possibilities in the future. In other words, no matter how many times he killed the other party could choose a future that wasn't killed. At that time, the various futures of being killed naturally wouldn't happen. The other party would naturally remain unharmed. Such an existence was difficult to deal with. It was 100 times stronger than what Luo Fan had imagined. as expected of an existence that entered this world from a state of chaos. Luo Fan sighed. Thinking of this, he raised his hand and pointed. The heaven-splitting axes that had just destroyed countless future pitch-black existences changed direction. With the largest heaven-splitting axes as the vanguard, they turned into a long river and directly rushed towards the pitch-black existence. This rush directly tore apart the surrounding dusky existences. In the process, the surrounding sound waves quickly collapsed and were replaced by brand new, truly perfect worlds that were not of the essence of sound wave. When the heaven-splitting axes river flowed past, the place where the heaven-splitting axes passed had already become a large group of worlds. It looked like a long world river was constantly spreading towards the pitch-black existence. At this moment, when the heaven-splitting axes river reached the place where the pitch-black existence was, the pitch-black existence disappeared without a trace like a bubble. During the whole process, he couldn't see any details, as if it was originally just a shadow. Luo Fan frowned, and the heaven-splitting axes river slightly rotated. It directly circled around his body. Pu, countless figures of the pitch-black existence appeared out of thin air where the heaven-splitting axes river passed, and disappeared without a trace like bubbles. Seeing this, Luo Fan instantly knew that he had guessed correctly. That pitch-black existence really wanted to use the method of reversing the flow of time to bring his different futures over to attack him. Really troublesome. Luo Fan felt a headache at this moment. At this moment, his body was actually still continuously collapsing, but the speed of the collapse was extremely complicated due to the time dimension where he was located. Therefore, it was extremely slow and the specific process was almost impossible to see. Now, he was in a dilemma. His mental state was counteracting his body, causing his body to take another step towards the abyss of collapse, causing his body to distort slightly. Fortunately, his reaction speed was extremely fast, and he quickly recovered. If I want to deal with it, I can only use the same method, which is to defeat and destroy it in countless futures. It's just that this ability is simply a method that only a true saint can use, and I'm still too far away from it. Luo Fan sighed, already making a judgment in his heart. At this moment, he discovered that outside the heaven-splitting axes river, the pitch-black existence had unknowingly gathered there again. Moreover, at this moment, the first sound he had made since he appeared came from his body. Destroy. Destroy. This voice used a language that Luo Fan had never heard before, and he didn't even think that there would be such a form of language in this world. It was a kind of language that would naturally make people feel an indescribable tyranny, producing an indescribable and lifeless voice. As for why he could clearly understand what this voice was saying, this was not a problem at all. It must be known that even ordinary itinerant immortals had the ability to hear the will behind any language and naturally understand the meaning of any language. Moreover, Luo Fan was an existence that had surpassed the false sage and despair realm. Even if this language was extremely special and had incredible power, he could still understand it clearly. However, even if he could understand this language, it was now secondary to Luo Fan. At this moment, he could clearly feel an inexplicable connection spreading from the pitch-black existence to his body. This connection made him feel as if he could already control this pitch-black existence. But at the same time, along with this inexplicable connection, there was also an indescribable tyranny, as well as unimaginable destructive power. This kind of tyranny, this kind of destructive power was extremely powerful and strange. Even though Luo Fan's Dao heart was extremely firm and could even transcend the world and reincarnation after being shattered into countless pieces, he couldn't resist such tyranny and this kind of destructive power. In a trance, he felt that everything around him had become so annoying. Whether it was the boundless gray existence, whether it was his spiritual light, the sky-splitting axe river, or the strange time dimension, or even himself, they had all become so annoying. It made people want to destroy it. Is this what the broken emperor felt like before? This thought instantly appeared in the depths of Luo Fan's heart. However, even such a small thought at this time, under the endless impact of the tyranny and destructive power around him, he felt that he was already on the verge of collapse, as if he would completely disappear in the next moment, causing his soul to completely sink. With such a change, at this moment, Luo Fan's eyes had already become red. The expression on his face gradually became ferocious and tyrannical, just when such a change was happening to Luo Fan's body. In front of him, the pitch-black existence outside the sky-splitting axe river also changed at the same time. On the back of the pitch-black existence, the two wings that were like the sky-splitting axe river fell off. Then, the body of the pitch-black existence began to shrink rapidly. In the process of shrinking, there was also an unknown amount of gray existence being spat out from within. After a while, the pitch-black existence, it had already turned into an extremely small black dot that seemed to have no size at all, quietly suspended in the gray. At this time, the two wings that were broken off also began to gradually shrink, slowly fusing. When the pitch-black existence completely shrank into a black dot, the two wings had completely fused into a ball of spiritual light, a ball of spiritual light composed of two different natures. That was obviously the part of the spiritual light that Luo Fan chopped at the pitch-black existence, but was bitten off. The sky-splitting axe river's spiritual light, if Luo Fan was still sober and knew all of this, he would definitely know that this whole process was the process of the pitch-black existence that entered this world from the state of chaos changing its master. In other words, Luo Fan's previous actions had somehow been recognized by this existence, causing it to actually transfer its original connection with the broken emperor to him. At this moment, Luo Fan was no longer paying attention to these things. At this time, his entire mind had fallen into a tyrannical and destructive sea. At this moment, there were endless waves surging in this sea, constantly hitting him, trying to sink him into the depths of the sea, into the bottom of the tyrannical and destructive sea. In a trance, there seemed to be countless of himself constantly telling him the beauty of destruction and the comfort of tyranny. And above this tyrannical and destructive sea was the scene of the outside world, which was where his body was. However, all of these scenes had already been distorted at this time. It seemed that everything that originally had no life or even a physical body had become an extremely ugly image, as if everything was tempting him to destroy it. Facing such changes, Luo Fan tried his best to protect the little bit of spirituality in his heart, trying to resist the impact of the tyrannical and destructive sea around him. The impact of the sea there was strong beyond imagination, and his mind, his will, was like a small wooden raft on this sea. Under the impact, it was already on the verge of collapse, and it felt like it could completely collapse at any time. This process continued with the passage of time. The state of his spirit and willpower that was about to collapse didn't improve at all during the whole process. It felt like he was dancing on the tip of a knife, and if he was not careful, he might die without a burial place. However, no matter how dangerous it was, Luo Fan's spirit and willpower were always able to escape from the sinking. One could faintly see that in the depths of his spirit and willpower there was an extremely stable fulcrum,